Hello everyone. This is the English version of the French video I made about Final Fantasy XVI that you can find in the description. These two videos are 99% the same, and the time difference between them is because I speak slower in English. If you speak French, you may want to try the French version instead, but the audio is better on this one, so do as you wish. This video uses footage from the French version of the game. I have translated into English everything that seems relevant using the subtitle from the English version of the game, and they will look like this. There are a few exceptions where I've used the translation of the French version instead of the English version. When that is the case, the subtitle will be in italic looking like this, so you can spot them easily. This video and its translation took me a very long time to make, so I hope you will enjoy it, and if so, don't hesitate to leave a like or a comment. Now, without any further ado, let's just start. There are two reasons to be disappointed with Final Fantasy XVI. The first comes from the fact it's the 16th Final Fantasy, and that can create a lot of expectation. Even if Final Fantasy games are famous for always being a tiny bit different from one to another, they all share a lot in common. Before we start, I just want to point out that I have not played all the Final Fantasy, but I still played the 1st, 2nd, 5th, 7th, 10th, 12th and 13th one, and I also played a little bit of Final Fantasy VI, 8 and 9. So even if I may have missed some specific features from certain opuses, I think I have a good idea of the series as a whole. Each game takes place in a distinct universe with its own cast of characters, but it's always about a group that is gonna try to save the world in a mostly linear story. The combat system offers plenty of variation, but it's always turn-based. Sometimes there is ATB, sometimes there is not. Sometimes we fight with a group of 4, sometimes we fight with a group of 3. Character classes may be forced on us by the game, or chosen before the adventure starts, and sometimes we can change them freely with the job system, for example. But we are always gonna find the same variation of white, black or blue mage, thief, warrior and so on. We're gonna have a wide choice of weapons and equipment that we can adapt to exploit enemies' weaknesses or protect ourselves more effectively against their attacks based on the status effect or elemental damage they may inflict. All of that with a bestiary very similar from one game to another. With technological progress, we've seen the appearance of minigames that can be more or less ambitious in what they offer, but which are still there. And then, there are all the things that twist those classic mechanics to bring something new with each title. Final Fantasy II does not have experience points. Our characters evolve based on their actions during combat. Final Fantasy V allows a lot of freedom in our team management, thanks to the job system. Final Fantasy X allows something similar with the sphere grid. Final Fantasy VII has materia that link magic to our equipment that requires licenses you can buy with special points in order to be used in Final Fantasy XII. A game that also has a gambit system to automate some of our characters' actions. And even if each of these mechanics is unique and only used in one game, that still makes them markers of the Final Fantasy series, JRPG with some unique mechanics. This is not an exhaustive list, of course. This is not the point of the video. I'm just talking about it to paint a rough picture of what we could call the Final Fantasy formula. Because Final Fantasy XVI has almost none of these elements. You do not play as a group of characters, but only as Clive. The turn-based combat system is replaced for a Devil May Cry style action combat with Gun of War runic attack. The RPG elements are limited to gaining a level when you kill things, there are no status effects or elemental weaknesses, resulting in almost no object or equipment management. And there is no minigame. That makes it a very different Final Fantasy, and to be clear, the fact that it's a different game doesn't make it a bad game. It just seemed legitimate to me for a long-time fan of the series to end up disappointed. But that's only one reason to be disappointed. The second reason is that the game is very variable in terms of quality. For every hour of action and spectacle, we have 2 hours of boring side quest. We go from boss fight full of great staging ideas to fights against boring bosses we have already faced 20 times. The bestiary is limited to around 20 monsters and soldiers, leading to a very repetitive combat system. A combat system that takes too long to become interesting in a game devoid of difficulty. The cutscenes are hardly very inspired and most of the time they look like this.
C'était pas si mal. Comment as-tu trouvé mon jeu d'acteur alors?
All of which gives the impression of a game that should have lasted for around 20 hours but have been stuffed with content to double its length. And yet, it offers a confusing story with so many inconsistencies and plot holes that I can't understand how it gets so much praise. I understand some people just want to see spectacle and don't care if that spectacle makes sense or not. But that critics can ignore or be satisfied with how Final Fantasy XVI develops some of its theme give me some anxiety. So much so that I spent several days wondering if I wasn't that guy from The Simpsons. And then I started coming across articles that talked about how the developers themselves were lost in the complexity of their story. Which reassured me, at first, and naturally led me to this first mechanic everyone seems to love. The active time lore. You see, one of the great inspiration sources for the game is Game of Thrones. And when I say it's inspired by Game of Thrones, it is to the point that the 30 or so people who started working on the game all had to watch the series. And if you also watch it, you probably noticed, some similarities between the two. The Iron Kingdom, located in Western Islands, recalls the Ironborn. Guts is older but able to speak. Clive's life mimics that of Jon Snow, who are both accompanied by a wolf. Jill is Theon Greyjoy, and I'm gonna stop here. You can easily find lists on the internet that summarize all these inspirations if that interests you. If I talk about it, it's because I think they wanted to recreate the same structure as Game of Thrones. But in Game of Thrones, each faction and each plotline is given the same amount of time to be developed, which is not the case here. We only follow Clive, and the rest of the plot is limited to cutscenes lasting a few minutes after a few key moments in the story. And they are neither long enough nor numerous enough to expose things. Imagine a character like Joffrey Baratheon, but with just 5 2-minute scenes in the entire series, and you will have a good idea of one of Final Fantasy XVI problems. It gets better as the game progresses, because you become more familiar with the different locations and different factions in the game, and because the cast gets reduced each time a character dies. But at first, it's a mess so big that even the people who worked on the game has trouble understanding it. But they figured that out in 2019, 3 years after the game development started, and I think it was too late to deeply modify the game. But they were well aware that something had to be done for players to not be completely lost, and that something was an encyclopedia. Well, it's not just an encyclopedia. There is the 1,000 tomes on one side, but also the State of the Realm, with the Grand Cast that summarizes all relationships between characters at every stages of the game, and a situation map that summarizes all the troop movements and border changes that are taking place. It's not a particularly new idea to have an encyclopedia directly in the game. Immediately, it made me think of the Pokédex or what we find in Metroid Prime with the scanner. But there is more. There is the active time lore, a system that allows access to the encyclopedia's files relevant to the situation you're in. If we open it during the first scene between the two armies at the beginning, it will give us information about these two armies, where we are, our squad, the mark we saw on Clive's cheek, and that's all. This is good because it avoids drowning the player into too much information. The game will even refuse to share information about certain characters to keep some mystery about who they are. And it's good to have an encyclopedia and an interactive map and a sociogram in the game. I wouldn't mind seeing one in every game that comes out. But there isn't one in every game that comes out, because in the vast majority of games, there is no need for it. Yes, it's good, there are plenty of tools to help players understand the story, but they are only necessary when the story is incomprehensible. It's also not the best thing to use. The sociogram and the interactive map are not very clear, to the point where I saw people open the map, spend 5 minutes looking at it before closing it, indicating they understood nothing of it. The story is so complicated that even the tools that are here to explain it are complicated. Even once we understand how it works, it's still a moment where you need to pause the game to get information about what's going on. Which is even worse with the chronography, since we can, and you probably will, open it during cutscenes, which completely kills their pace. I don't want to pretend that I am some kind of movie expert here, But pausing a movie every 5 minutes to read the wiki isn't the best way to enjoy it. You should try to prevent players from wanting to pause the game during cutscenes as much as possible, not give them good reason to do so. In the first 10 minutes, the game introduces 4 different countries: the Empire of Sambrek, the Iron Kingdom, the Dalmatian Republic, and Valud. And also Shiva, and Titan, and Hugo, and Benedicta, and Barnabas, and so on. Then there is a flashback that lasts an hour and a half before returning to the beginning event. It's likely that quite a few people end up kinda lost at this point. This is why the active time lore exists. But by having such a daunting start, the game encourages players to use that functionality, and since the information changed during cutscenes, it even prompts players to open it each time a new character appears. That could have been a good tool if it wasn't there to fix a broken narration and didn't encourage players to pause the game during cutscenes while ruining their pace. But there is another small, tiny problem with this encyclopedia. Because you see, these developers who were lost in the story and have the idea of adding an encyclopedia? Well, they made the encyclopedia, which gave us the only possible result. The encyclopedia is confused. You can check it very easily. Just start a new game. There is the first cutscene, where Clive remembers the fight between Ifrit and Phoenix. Then there is the insert telling us the action takes place in 873. The game explains our mission, which is to kill Shiva's dominant. There is a quick tutorial, and the game's second cutscene starts. This is where you can access the active time lore for the first time. There is a little explanation about how it works, and there you have it. It talks about a war in 865 at the Nisade file. But that is not possible. There is another file that talked about a war in 865 between Dalmatia and the Iron Kingdom, but it is still not possible. Because in the dialogue that mentions the previous war between Dalmatia and the Iron Kingdom, they specify that the Iron Kingdom had no dominant at that time.
Si je me souviens bien, c'est vous qui aviez repoussé les sangs de rouille lors de la dernière guerre, n'est-ce pas? Vous vous en sortirez.
Et d'après nos espions, le royaume de fer dispose aussi d'un émissaire. Nous ne sommes plus du tout dans la même position.
Except, the Iron Kingdom captured Jill in 860, and she later says that her powers awoken right after. So in 865, the Iron Kingdom have had the dominant for 5 years, dominant which they only view as war weapons. Jill herself says they force her to fight for them as soon as her powers awakened. So this war should have taken place before 860, not after. Even if we want to be generous and recognize that maybe they have gone to war without their best war weapon, which they only view as a war weapon, that doesn't solve the issue that there are no events at the Nisade file listed between 860 and 873 on the situation map. I don't know if the file has a wrong date, or if the situation map is incomplete, or both, or if it's the cutscenes dialogues that are wrong. What I know is that the story is so complicated and full of inconsistencies that even the tool created exclusively to help us understand it contradict themselves, and they contradict themselves from the first explanation. I also want to add that the information contained in the encyclopedia's entries are not always the same depending on the language in which you read them. For example, in French or Spanish, it is said that the icons were created by the Fallen thanks to their Magitech technology. Whereas in Japanese or Italian, it just says that the word icon comes from the Fallen, implying they did not create the icon of the game. This is even more implied in the English version and completely stated in the German version, which specifies that the icons that we come across in the game appeared much later. Also, the French and Japanese version talk about summoners with the ability to summon the icon, a detail missing from the other versions I looked at. The Spanish version stands out by having the idea of invocation, but it is the icons that are used to activate the weapons, while in all other versions, they are the weapons. And all of those information, regardless of the language involved, are more or less contradicted by other nodes or by the events of the game.
C'est un vrai foutoir.
So for simplicity's sake, I will ignore the encyclopedia and the information it contains. Either the information are the same as what the game tells via its dialogue and cutscenes, and I don't need the encyclopedia to confirm it, either they are a contradiction and I will then consider that it is the story that is told to us via the dialogues and cutscenes that is the real story, and that the error comes from the encyclopedia. As I said, it was not planned at the start of development and it is completely optional. You can play the entire game without ever reading a single one of its entries. Entries whose meaning changes depending on the language in which you read them.
J'espère t'avoir bien renseigné.
To me, that shows a lack of care given to the story and the world that they wanted to create. For spoiler reason, I've mainly talked about what some people might see as lore and may think it's not important if it's not very well written. But you see, those who wrote the lore, they wrote the rest of the game too. That lack of care is present everywhere with a lot of consistency problems. It's even difficult to find elements that aren't affected by this in the game. It's got to the point where if you like to nitpick like cinema scenes, you want it to yourself to play this game. It will undoubtedly be your best purchase of the year. But as in my previous video on Octopath Travelers, the goal will not be to look at all the little details that are wrong, but rather to see how it impacts the overall experience we will have of the game, starting with the gameplay.
En avant!
We can use the sword while on the ground or in the air for combos of 4 or 3 hits. There is magic for ranged attack, which can be combined with sword strikes, a dash that ends in a sword strike, a charge attack, a dive attack, and an execution for enemies who have fallen to the ground. In terms of movement, we have a very generous dodge, we can double jump on the heads of enemies to stay airborne longer, and that's about it. There is also a taunt, and you can get up quickly after taking a big hit in the face. I think that's some good base, and that allows a lot of mobility, and there is even some room for combos. Then, there are all the dominant skills that we obtain during the game. They are all similar: a single target attack, a multi-target attack, and a big ultimate attack. There is also a more situational move and each dominant special skill. For example, for Garuda, Gouge is the single target attack, Wicked Wheel is the group attack, Aerial Blast is the ultimate attack, Rook's Gambit is the situational attack, and finally the special skill is Deadly Embrace. I think this is a good combat system in itself, but I think it's badly used in the game. A critique I saw a lot is that bosses have too much life, and I think this encapsulates most of the issues about the game's combat system. A fight duration is directly linked to the quantity of life the enemies have, and by extension, how difficult the fight is going to be. Enemies with more life are longer to kill, which leads to longer fights, and the longer the fight, the more susceptible you are of making mistakes. But Final Fantasy XVI is not intended as a difficult game, at least I don't think so. There are checkpoints during boss battle. If you die, you get all your potions back. The dodge lets you dodge everything and it's very easy to trigger, and enemies don't hit hard at all. The game doesn't want to be hard so badly, even the hard mode is not available by default. That doesn't mean there are not some difficult fights, but they are rare and it's side content. Final Fantasy XVI doesn't try to be hard, Final Fantasy XVI tried to be fun and spectacular. I'm not saying this like if bosses needed to be hard in order to be good. I never felt challenged in FF16, but I enjoy the main bosses a lot. By main bosses, I'm thinking about all the bosses that end the game's dungeons, or all the bosses that we only fight once. If I wanted to make a tier list, it would probably look like that. With the exception of the fights against Garuda and Titan, I find them all very cool. And if you're thinking the list like some bosses like Shiva or Shirada or the different dragons or Necrophobe, well, I didn't make the template, okay, but also I enjoy them all. They are not challenging, but they are spectacular. They have a lot of different attack patterns that require different kinds of dodges. You can dodge everything with the dodge, but it's sometimes easier to jump above an attack or to run out of the damage zone. And attacks came quickly enough to create a flow. One of the things that impressed me the most was that even with all the visual effects the game has, the action was always readable. I streamed my first playthrough and I was asked a lot about how I managed to understand what was happening in that kind of mess. And I don't know, I didn't need to think about it, it was easy. That's probably a bit because of the very generous dodge. If you react a bit too soon or a bit too late, the game gives you the dodge. And if you miss and get hit, you're not gonna take a lot of damage anyway. The game is easy, but that allows it to offer a spectacle that would probably not work if it wasn't that easy, and instead require very precise dodges to not die into it. The problem starts when the spectacle ends. We can put enemies in 3 groups. One will be the bosses, the ones with the big health bar in the top right corner, the trash mobs, the ones that only have a health bar, and finally mini-bosses that have a health bar and a stun bar but that are not displayed on the top right corner. I know there are a few monsters that are more mini-bosses even if they don't have the yellow stun bar, which makes them some of the hardest enemies in the game, but anyway. Bosses are cool because of the spectacle, but that spectacle only exists during boss fights. Combats against mini-bosses doesn't have that spectacle, and this is where the big health bar, in addition to the game being easy, starts to be an issue. Easy fights mean you don't have to pay that much attention to what's happening, which can lead you into doing the same combos with your sword, you press dodge when the mini-boss moves, you drink a potion if you get hit a few times, and you win. It's easy, but it's not super fun. And since mini-bosses have lots of health, that not super fun combat takes 2 minutes, and that creates another issue. As the game progresses, we get more and more of the special attacks I was talking about. It's supposed to be divine power, and I think that, in order to make us feel that power, the devs decided they needed to deal a lot of damage. For example, in that fight, this is the health bar before and after my 4-hit sword combo. And this is before and after I use my special attacks. That's why bosses and mini-bosses have so much health, because without it, they would be obliterated by Clive's power. Except they do end up being obliterated by the end of the game. It's not hard to find synergies that deals a lot of damage, and when that happens, mini-bosses start to melt. Even if you're not trying to find synergy and you just use the techniques you like, they are still going to deal so much damage, they are going to be, and by far, your main source of damage. And the game encourages you into using those techniques as much as possible. When you have to fight enemies with so much health, you feel like you are hitting them with a sword made of plastic during fights that are not super fun to begin with. And that's without talking about the game displaying the damage you've done at the end of an enemy's stun that will incite player into hitting them as hard as possible just to see the number go up. And soon enough, fights become a routine where you use the same technique in the same way, whether you fight mini-bosses or trash mobs. The trash mobs are worthy of their name in that game. They will almost never attack you, and when they do, it's with very basic attacks. They all look the same, firstly because there are not a lot of different enemy models in the game. There are the humans, the wolves, the plants, the spiders, the scorpions, and the robots. That's already not a lot, but the real issue here is that they all behave the same. There is no major difference between fighting humans or wolves or spiders. They all have the same basic movement and attacks they don't use. Sometimes you will find a mage that can do a barrier spell or a plant that can heal other enemies, but that's kind of all. In God of War, there are not a lot of different enemy types, but they all have a distinct identity. Elves can fly around and blind you. Ice dudes cannot be hurt with your axe, which forces you to use other weapons. The floating eyes can possess other enemy, which makes them stronger, or they can attack you at range. It's not a lot, but it's enough to create a unique identity for the enemies and for the battles where we fight them, by forcing you to make choices based on each situation. By having all the enemies fighting in the same way in Final Fantasy XVI, every fight against trash mobs feels like every other fight against trash mobs. Like for the mini-bosses, they are at risk of being less and less interesting and more repetitive. The good news is, they don't have a lot of health. You feel like you're hurting them when you hit them with your sword. They have a life bar that sounds about right for video games enemies. But that's where the huge health bar from bosses start to fuck up the game again. Let me explain. The combat system has the potential for combos. You can hit trash mob in the right way and do crazy looking combos like what you see on the screen right now. But that's only possible in training mode, against an adversary with infinite life, because without that infinite life, mobs die too fast. They've put bosses with so much health, they needed to give us super powerful techniques so fight don't last forever, and the result is that basic enemies can't do anything. Even if you try to have fun and use a combat system to do nice looking combos instead of optimizing it, you will find out that you can't. And I want to make it clear that I don't think the combat system is bad in itself. As I said earlier, I think it has solid foundations and the problem comes from enemies that are being reused too much and have too much health. A problem that is far more present if you do the side quest for reasons we are going to discuss later. But what I just say is only relevant for Clive, because there are some moments where we fight as Ifrit. I don't like the fight against Garuda, and that's mainly because of the Ifrit part of the fight. We have almost no move. We can hit her with a treat combo, cast some fireballs, dodge her attacks, use a dodge to quickly get closer to her, and that's all. They took Clive's base movement and removed half of it. We can't even jump anymore. But with such limited movement options, the boss attacks must be very limited, otherwise we will not be able to react to it. So we end up dodging the 3 same attack while trying to hit her with the 2 same moves until the end of the fight 5 minutes later. I do not think that's the best introduction for immense Icon battles to have the first being a slow and boring fight like that. I think the devs wanted us to unlock new abilities throughout the game so we can get a feeling of progression, which would also reflect Clive's progress as he gets better at controlling his Icon. Except that not being able to jump doesn't give me the impression that Clive doesn't fully control Ifrit, it just gives me the impression they had no idea what to do with Ifrit moveset, so they gave him the same action as Clive, while removing half of it for the first fight so they had something to add later. Even if Ifrit ends up going to space, his gameplay won't be stellar. We don't even get new abilities when we become Ifrit Ryzen. By the end of the game, all we got is Clive base movement and 2 special abilities, whereas Clive can have 6 special abilities that we can choose from a 30 abilities list. With the exception of the fight against Typhoon, I always got the impression they were a bit too long and a few more abilities would have helped. That would have had variety and a way to deal more damage, which would have made the fight shorter and more interesting. It would also have made more sense story-wise for Ifrit to steal an ability to each Icon instead of only stealing one from Titan and one from Bahamut. But that's only for Ifrit. Clive starts with more options and ends with more options. I think the part of the Garuda fight where we play as Clive is far better than the part where we play as Ifrit. I don't like Garuda's tornado attack that makes the fight unreadable, and it's a character that can fly, but when the fight starts she decides to stay on her knees so we can kick her ass. But besides that, I think it's far more enjoyable when we play as Clive. As I was saying, we unlock around 30 abilities, even if we could only equip 6 of them. That gives some options to build a character based on how we want to play. Do you choose to use counters, or do you prefer abilities that help with crowd controls? Maybe you want to be able to stun enemies as fast as possible, or to hit them as hard as possible. There are some options on how you want to fight, and I like that. We can even refound abilities whenever we want. This allows us to change between them as we wish and to adapt them to every situation, and also to test them easily. But even if we can technically change them all we want, it's more likely that we find a few that we like and stick with them. And since there are long stretches of game between each new set of abilities, there is a risk that after a player finds 6 that he likes, he stays with them without testing the other ones that much. This is where the trials comes in. There are 2 kinds of trials. We can redo the game missions trying to do combos in order to get the best possible score, and there are also some specific trials tied to each Icon. In those, you need to survive 4 time-limited combats. What I think is very smart is that for each fight, Clive's abilities are imposed by the game, and you need to perform specific actions in order to gain time. Some are in every trial, like finishing an enemy that has fallen to the ground or alternating sword and magical attacks, but there are others that ask to use Icon's ability to their full potential. So for example, in Titan trials, you need to successfully use its counter to counter an enemy attack in order to gain more time. That forces players to use different abilities and see how they work. how the cooldown can change depending on how you use them, and basically to see what we like and what we don't. And that made the Chronolith trials perfect tutorials. Or at least, that's what I would have liked to say. Because for some reason, they only unlock when we reach the last part of the story after 20 or 30 hours of game, depending on how much time you spend doing side quests. And why? You've made great tutorials, why are they only available at the end of the game? And why are they only accessible through stones that are hidden away? I do not get it. Like, the only explanation I can see is that the devs wanted their world to have some stuff to find in it, but even that doesn't sound like a good explanation to me. It seems so better to have those trials available right after Clive unlocked new icon powers at the Hideaway Stone, so we can test our new power right away, using what would have been a great tutorial, and then to have the hard version available through the stone we find in the world. I even think that would have made the exploration more interesting. There is a lot of stuff to find in the world, a lot of stuff shining on the ground, but you just need to pick one up and see it's only 4 guilds to realize they're pointless. You can also find chests that rarely have more interesting content. Some contain accessories that can improve Clive's stats or abilities. I think that's the only rewards that are at least a tiny bit cool to find, but there is the same problem that there is in any game with that kind of accessories. The vast majority of them are useless because they improve abilities the player don't use. Crafting materials could have been nice things to find, but they are useless because there is nothing interesting to craft. And on top of that there is a chronolith we can find and they don't work, we will need to come back at the end of the game. There is a lot of stuff to find in the world, but there is nothing interesting to find.
Il ne se passe rien.
Obviously, I think I need to explain a little bit why I consider there is nothing to craft in the game, because if we want to be factual, there are a lot of things to craft. But there is no elemental effect, or status effect, or bonus for certain kinds of physical attacks, or whatever else we can usually find in an RPG. Here you can choose between the sword with the best stats, or another sword that doesn't have the best stats, because there is nothing else to differentiate them. Even the physical damage and stun damage values are the same. These are the only two values weapons have, how much damage it's gonna do and how much stun it's gonna inflict when we strike with it. But every weapon's values are close when they are not the same. The best weapon to stun enemy you can find will also be the best weapon to deal damage to enemy. There are also armors to craft with the same issue. There are only two stats that exist, how much defense and health points they provide, and there is not more choice to make than with the weapons. In the end, even if we can craft a lot of stuff, at best it's gonna be a weapon or armor that is slightly better than the one we already have. And that's without talking about the fact that Clive has a sword we can continuously upgrade using the main quest rewards. The good part is the game knows we always have access to a good weapon even if we don't explore or do side content. But that makes exploring or doing side content in order to get crafting materials something useless, because even if there are a lot of things to craft, there is nothing interesting to craft. I even think filling a world with useless junk like they did is counterproductive. In my first playthrough I never found Odin's or Shiva's stone, not because they were well hidden, this is where we find Shiva's stone. When you see a little corner like this on the map, you know there is something. I didn't find them because at that moment I have already explored so many of those tiny corners without finding anything interesting that I have been conditioned by the game to assume there were never gonna be anything interesting to find. To the point where a 30-second detour from the main path looked like a waste of time. Which is a shame because Odin's and Shiva's stone are probably the two best things there is to find in this world, since they are the only two stones already active when we find them. I still think they failed at being good tutorials because they remain hidden challenges that should have been highlighted by the game, but at least you don't get the disappointment of finding something that isn't working yet. There is so much useless crap everywhere. When I ended up at the part of the game where there was cool stuff to find, I had lost interest. The game features a lot of different environments, offering a lot of variety. Forest, river, volcano, different towns with different architectures, different mines each with its own color theme, and so on. There could be more. I'm particularly sad we never visit another land because I always like snow in video games, but as I said, the game has variety. Except we don't really enjoy that variety. All of those places I mentioned can only be explored once. There are dungeons we go to during the main quests, and they're gone. It's not a problem in itself. If I play Bayonetta, I don't care to go from one linear level to another without being able to come back to the first one. But in Bayonetta, there are not, 75 side quests. They needed to put those quests somewhere, but somehow, instead of putting them around all those places I mentioned before, the devs put them in the 5 same areas. Area where you also find 2/3 of the main quest. So we find ourselves spending more time in Rosaria, Sunbreak and Dalmekia than in any other place in the game. If you do every side quest, you're gonna spend more time in those 3 zones taken separately than in all the other zones combined. We find ourselves with a game full of different environments who become repetitive because it only uses 3. Even Ash, the last big area we can explore, is almost empty. On the map, it's a gigantic island, but when you get there, it turns out this is the smallest zone of the 4. Worst is that we unlock access to it only after the sky turns to a shitty purpley color, which adds a shitty purpley filter everywhere. I think the point was to add some variety to the environments with new lighting, but to me the only result I see is that we go from 3 distinct areas to 4 that look the same. For me, the game would have been better with more places we can explore. And I don't mean it like the game needed more areas, but more like in we should have free access to all, or at least some of the dungeon areas that are only accessible during the main quest. So we can enjoy more of the variety the game had, and I don't think that would have been a lot of work since the areas already exist. I know we could use the trials to revisit them, and that's cool, but that's the same content over and over. What I would have liked was to use those areas for some of the side quests, so we can spend less time in the 3 main areas and enjoy more of the game environment's diversity. That would not have solved all the problems regarding environment variety, because every zone is a corridor filled with the same enemies. Wherever you go, you are going to find palette swap wolves, the spiders, the scorpions, dragons, plants and soldiers. That's a very classic thing to find. There is palette swap enemies in Final Fantasy series in the first game and in many other released before and after. There is recycled content everywhere for a lot of good and bad reasons, and I'm not gonna talk about why in that video because I already did it in the Elden Rings one. Final Fantasy XVI problem is that instead of having enemies that look similar from place to place, it has enemies that look the same everywhere. And that gives even more the feeling that all the places are the same. Another thing I don't really get is why the only way to move through the world is via the map. We can't just walk through the world, we have to teleport. The game wants us to teleport so badly, it asks us to do it in the middle of cinematics. Look at this. We are in a cinematic, the game opens the map so we can teleport, and the cutscene resumes. Cutscene, map, cutscene. Cutscene, map, cutscene. Cutscene, map, cutscene. Why? The only explanation I see is to help players understand where they are. But more often than not, we are asked to teleport back to the hideaway, which is the central point of the game. People know where it is. The rest of the time there is a text to showcase where we are, and we can still open the map if we feel lost. For me, the main effect is to once again ruin the flow of cutscene. I really don't get that decision. The same way I don't understand why we cannot just walk from one area to another. When we reach the border of an area, there is a line, and if you go past it, instead of sending us to the area that is connected to it, the game opens the map so we can teleport. That confused me a lot about how people move around in that world and how teleportation worked. Teleportation, or fast travel, call it what you prefer, can work in 2 different ways. Either it's intradiegetic or it's extra-diegetic. Diegetic, which comes from the ancient Greek diegesis, which means the narration. Something intradiegetic is something that exists in the narration, while something extra-diegetic is something exterior to the narration. That's usually used to talk about music in movies, but we can also use those words to talk about video games. For example, in FF16, when we use the orchestrion to play some music, the music comes from the orchestrion, we can hear it as much as Clive, it's intradiegetic. But when we go to Sunbreak, we can hear Sunbreak's theme, but Clive cannot because he is not accompanied by an orchestra, the music is not in the world, it's extra-diegetic. We can use the same way of thinking for teleportation. If we look at Final Fantasy XII, the game starts in the royal city of Rabanastre, a big city with a teleportation system. You just need to talk to the moguls that run the TP and you can use it to travel around freely. That teleportation system is intradiegetic, it's public transit that everyone can use. That's the same thing in Final Fantasy XIV, where every time you teleport, your character performs an animation that shows he is actually teleporting. In both of those games, we can also take planes between different major cities. It looks like a teleportation. We speak to an NPC at the airport, there is a loading screen, and we arrive at our destination. But that teleportation is extra-diegetic. Even if the travel only takes a loading for us, our character has been sitting in the plane the entire flight. Something that we can kind of experience when we rent a Chocobo in FF14. There is no loading, just enjoy the view. I see teleportation as intradiegetic because the character actually teleports, and fast travel as extra-diegetic because the character travels but it happens fast. But game use the two instinctively when it's not completely another term like move in the Japanese or French version of this game. The reason I'm talking about all that is because, at first, I was thinking we were in the first scenario with Final Fantasy XVI. There are obelisks to find and activate in order to be used as teleportation points, and they are usually found in town. It looked like an in-world teleportation system, something people can use, which would explain the lack of connectivity between zones. But then I realized Clive doesn't need to be near an obelisk to teleport himself, and there are a lot of places where we do travel that don't have an obelisk. Like the Hideaway. There is also that moment where we're going to go to the Shadow Coast and there is dialogue explaining it's going to take us a few days of travels.
Combien de temps faut-il pour aller au Gris-le-Vent?
Ma foi, on y sera en quelques jours avec l'entreprise.
You may ask yourself, why am I talking about that? And that's because it completely ruined my immersion to be in a world where every pieces were so disconnected that I can't even walk through them, while every time I'm traveling I'm supposed to be doing it on foot. The fact that there is no connection between Rosaria, Sanbreque and Dhalmekia makes the world feel completely fake. The game talks about migration, populations abandoning their home and commercial exchange, but there is no road for that to happen. That leads to a lot of strange moments, like when Jill asks what is the best road to Phoenix Gate, while there is only one road that exists. Sid and Clive arguing about what's the best road to Sanbreque, while again, there is only one. Are they all dumb or what? And the game reminds us that lack of interaction every time it opens the map and asks us to teleport. I also wonder about all those moments where we go on quest with other people from the Hideaway, but we don't live together. Every time I was thinking about the poor Obolus, who must have done so many back and forth with only one person aboard. But there is also the fact the world is dangerous. Traveling separately from each other doesn't seem like the best possible idea to me. There is a point where Karen talks about the fact we are wanted everywhere and maybe we could pose as the bodyguard of Guts who is a merchant.
Si vous allez au Dominion, alors je vous conseille d'emmener ce grand bonnet.
Guts?
Oh, pardon. Auriez-vous oublié que la terre entière veut la tête du renégat? Vous pourriez vous faire passer pour les gardes du corps d'un marchand au lieu de vous pointer comme des fleurs. Enfin, moi je dis ça, je dis rien, hein.
Everyone seems to like the idea.
Guts? Ravi que tu nous accompagnes.
And they don't live together. He's just waiting for us at the end of the quest.
On se retrouve à Poclade!
That same idea of pretending to be a bodyguard also happened at the start of the game, when we travel with Jill in Rosaria. Clive is a branded, a slave, and their only right is to remain silent, so he decides to pretend to be Jill's personal guard.
Avec ma marque de pourvoyeur, je ne suis pas discret. Alors on va dire que je suis un soldat pourvoyeur et que toi, tu es ma noble maîtresse, d'accord?
And it's good they thought about it. But when we come across an NPC with a side quest 5 minutes after we establish that Jill should act as her honor, it's Clive who interacts with him. Even when the guy says he doesn't like the idea of borrowing someone else's brand,
même si ça me gêne d'utiliser le marqué d'un autre.
Jill doesn't intervene to say it's okay. Yeah, Clive can do the quest. The guy acts as if Jill doesn't exist, because at that moment, she doesn't exist. It's not something specific to this quest, but something that happened with all side quests in the game. The people who accompany Clive, like Jill, will never say anything and will never intervene. Because for Jill to say to that guy she agrees, Clive can do his quest, you need to write additional dialogue and you need to record them, in the 6 languages that the game offers. That would already be a lot of extra work, especially in a game with 75 side quests. But you see, you don't have to do the quest as soon as they are available. You can skip them and come back later, when Jill is no longer with us and has been replaced by someone else, which would mean for each side quest you would have to record lines of dialogues for each character that could be with us at any given time, just in case you decided to do that side quest at that given time. So I understand very well the decision to act as if Clive was alone in the side quest. But it has the drawback of giving the impression that Clive is alone, making the relationship he is supposed to have with other characters as artificial as the world we explore. I also have a hard time seeing Jill or Joshua as important characters when they can be discarded so easily as soon as we are no longer in the main quest. Between this game and Octopath Traveler, we can really feel the Square Enix touch when it comes to depicting relationships between characters that feel completely fake. Which brings us to the next part, the side quest and how bad they are. They all work the same. We get a quest by talking to an NPC, he sends us somewhere to kill a few monsters and pick up an item, then we go back and we give him the item. Or it is the opposite and the NPC gives us an item we need to deliver to someone, like delivering apples for example. The first problem I wanted to talk about are the quest markers. Here is what H-Bomber had to say about them in his Fallout 3 critique.
A good game can tell you where to go effortlessly through the design of its levels, or by giving you enough directions that you can put the pieces together yourself. This is good because it encourages the player to be aware of their surroundings, which lets them fully appreciate the worlds the designers have built and all the neat personal touches to it. When you build a world centered around giving them a blip on their radar to walk towards in a straight line, you hamstring not just their own sense of going on their own journey and making their own decisions, but you've created a situation where the game is teaching you to follow this with your brain. Your eyes are trained to follow it, to stare at it, to just go where it tells you to. The levels can be often quite nice looking, with fun little things to look at, but your eyes are here at all times.
And it's the same thing with Final Fantasy XVI. We are following a GPS far more than exploring a world here. In older Final Fantasy, you needed to talk to the NPCs in the game and understand what they were saying to get clues on what to do, a bit like the quest in Dark Souls. With technical improvements, worlds have gotten bigger and more populated, and having to talk to all the NPCs to see if they have something to tell us can quickly become annoying, and the arrival of quest markers. But even with that in mind, Final Fantasy XVI is not particularly populated or even big. You can talk to more people in the first turn of Final Fantasy XII, which has a far bigger world to explore, but manages just fine without quest markers. I understand some players want markers because it makes the game easier to play, and I have no problem with that. But I think we could at least have the option to remove markers that don't even have the decency to be in the corner of the screen. They are in the middle and on the side, and what the fuck is that interface, honestly? The game seems to agree with that idea as the markers pollute the screen or prevent us from being invested in the quest it's trying to tell us, since it removes them by itself at times. Quest markers are removed during fight, for example. Well, except if the fight is part of the quest, because then you can be sure every monster will have its own icon. In certain quests, the marker points to an area, but once in that area it disappears, forcing you to pay minimum attention to the environment. So why can't we turn them off? This is even worse than not being able to turn them off, because there is an option to manage the side quest markers. But it only allows you to choose which quests are displayed in the HUD, and if we choose none, the game chooses them for us. Why? There is even that wonderful moment when the game forces us to progress in the main quest before being able to do any side content. But the side quests are still displayed with a lock. We can't do them, but even then we can't remove them from the screen. Seriously, what the fuck? And to top it off, the game even seems designed to not have the quest markers. NPCs call for help when you pass by them.
Hey, vous! Par ici!
And when they give you a quest, they also give you details on where to go and what to do. From a functional point of view, the quests are well written. They could have easily required us to pay attention to the world around us, but instead the quest markers make that impossible. The other problem is there isn't a huge variety of enemies in the game. Quests asking you to fight almost all the time don't help hiding the problem. We quickly get the impression there are only 10 types of enemies because, well, there are only 10 types of enemies in the game, but also because we spend our time fighting those 10 types of enemies. Out of the 75 side quests, there are like 65 where we face the same enemies and the same mini-bosses. It's recycling content that becomes more and more obvious as we progress throughout the game. I perfectly understand the difficulty of having lots of different enemies in an action game, but I don't understand the will to make us face the same enemies over and over again, especially in a game where the fight against mobs and mini-bosses does not give any particular challenge or spectacle. It's the same thing with the environments. The game only uses 5 for the side quest and they become very repetitive. But once you see everything the combat or environments has to offer with the first quest, in the next one there is nothing more to appreciate than the story. Except, as I said earlier, the story doesn't really make any sense. Even when the story is somewhat cool, there is almost always something that ruins everything if you spend more than 2 minutes thinking about what's happening. For example, we have Blackthorn's questline. He is Hideaway's blacksmith and there are a few quests that develop his character. They show us someone who is always looking to improve, he seeks quality above all, and that's even why he joined Siege rather than becoming the chief of his hometown. A town he fled so he could continue forging rather than having to do some paperwork. And this desire to always improve will lead him to return to his hometown where he will have to confront his past to finally be able to forge the best weapons in the game. I think that's all very good. The problem is that 2 meters away from his workshop, there is Guts, who is presented as a guy, how to say it?
Guts, amène-la en haut.
Mais mamie va...
T'en fais pas pour Caronne. J'ai payé ses frais.
tout payer?
He's a little bit dumb. And he is no blacksmith. Gus is a merchant, but he is able to forge the same weapons as Blackthorn without even having access to a forge, with nothing more than a hammer. I don't think you can write a series of 4 quests that talk about how hard it is to become a good blacksmith, all the sacrifices that are required, and at the same time create a character that is inspired by Odor, who become as talented as Blackthorn just by looking at him. And I think I get what the devs wanted to do. The 2 moments where Guts acts as a blacksmith are in the middle of long dungeons. They wanted us to have a checkpoint so we could buy some potions or upgrade our equipment. But that would have made little sense to be able to teleport back to the hideaway, so instead, the hideaway come to us in the shape of Guts. Except, what's the point? We are in a dungeon. If we die, our inventory is going to be filled with potion. We cannot run out. And for our equipment, at best we are going to be able to forge a new weapon that hits 2% stronger in a game where the vast majority of our damage come from special attacks anyway. Guts acting as a blacksmith doesn't add much gameplay-wise or quality of life-wise, in contrast to the inconsistency the situation brings, in a game where the longest side quest is about the difficulty of being a blacksmith. And if having a checkpoint was that important for the devs, why did we come with Guts and not with Blackthorn?
Ben, je vois pas pourquoi je devrais me démener pour un type que je connais même pas, c'est pas mon boulot.
At the end of the game, there is a quest where Gav asks us to find a silver chocobo feather, so we can make a lucky charm for a child who will soon be born in the hideaway. That's an important event for him, because he was there to rescue the mother, and apparently there has never been a birth in the hideaway before. So we go in search of a silver chocobo feather, a native species of the northern lands which are plagued by the blight. It's been several years since anyone has seen one. But after an investigation, which consists of talking to 3 people, we discover that 2 chocobos have just made a nest right next of Martha's Rest. That's lucky. It's so unexpected that even Gav is surprised when we bring back the feather.
Je m'attendais à ce que tu m'aides, mais tu m'as carrément rapporté la plume du premier coup. Je suis scié.
By some stroke of luck, this species that has been extinct for 5 years reappeared just when we need it, and then they disappear again.
C'est une sacrée coïncidence, dis donc.
But that will be missing the real issue, because Clive has a chocobo. I don't know if you see what I mean. This game is so great, asking us to look for a silver chocobo feathers, hoping the species isn't extinct while we ride on a fucking silver chocobo. The game tried to tell a touching story about a birth and tell us more about Gav's past, but it's told in such a way that all I can see is them being completely dumb. Why don't we just take a feather from Ambrosia? And okay, to get the chocobo you need to have done another side quest, so it's possible to not have Ambrosia when Gav asks us about the feather. But why not have them linked? If we've already done the quest to get Ambrosia, we already have the feather and we just get the cool story with Gav, and if we haven't done it, the investigation to find the silver chocobo sends us to the quest where we find Ambrosia, that way we get a mount in addition to the cool story, and we avoid the inconsistencies that make the character look like idiots. And if they really wanted us to have a quest talking about animal species on the brink of extinction, which is one of the game's themes that we are going to discuss later, They could have done a far better job than a quest where we talk to 3 NPCs to find out that it's alright. We could have had a grand quest asking us to explore the different areas of the game to look for species that might have gone extinct. Arpocrat could have given us information about their ecologies to help us find them in a way where we wouldn't need quest markers, and that could have also enriched the series' lore. That would have made the areas more unique and give us more reason to explore while developing the game's themes. And I'm convinced that could have worked because of the hunt. For me, this is the best side quest in the game. It's simply a list of enemies to hunt and kill. As you progress through the story, new enemies are unlocked for a total of 27 different mini-bosses. Mini-bosses that are pretty cool. They are not really unique, but represent one of the most difficult versions of each kind of enemies in the game. There are even some monsters that are almost exclusive to the hunt. And they're not harder because they have more health or do more damage, but because they have more moves. And I think this is the best approach to increase difficulty. It's also in this quest that we find the mini-bosses without a stagger bar that I found more difficult than most of the other bosses and mini-bosses, because they do not spend half the fight unconscious on the floor. And to find those monsters, you can't just follow a quest marker. There are no quest markers. Instead, you must use information and hints from the hunt board. Sometimes the target's location is clearly stated, and sometimes it remains vague. Like for this target, it is indicated it was in some break and it ended up sealed away behind a magical mist and is now in some woodland. Of course, this is not the riddle of the century. You just have to open the map and see a place named Morne Brume and make the connection with the wanted posters that talk about mist. But it's not meant to be a hard riddle. It's just there for the player to explore, open the map and pay a little attention to the world around them. There is no quest marker indicating a route to follow, and it makes everything much more immersive. For a moment, you move through the game following a path you made yourself using a map. And also, the hunts are just fights. The game doesn't add mobs and cutscene. If you don't like the combat in the game, you're here for the story, you can skip the hunt and you won't miss anything. Whereas with the other side quest, you will have to kill mobs and mini-bosses over and over again to reach the story, without the fights necessarily having any reason to exist in the story in question. You could remove the fight part of half of the quest and they will still work just fine story-wise. I would think that the quest where you need to pick up flowers become interesting because you have to kill a Gigas along the way. I would have preferred to have, on one side, a fight against a Gigas with more moves than the others I already faced 10 times, and on the other side just having to collect flowers. You don't make something boring more interesting by adding another boring thing to it. It just makes things even more boring. I think the combat system, the area design and the world design have issues, but these issues are exacerbated by the side quest. You will spend hours in the same 3 zones until you have the impression they are the only 3 zones in the game, because almost all of the side quests are in those 3 zones. All the little details those 3 areas have are hidden behind the head-up display that covers the entire screen to make sure you're never lost, but also that you never need to pay attention to what's going on around you. The small number of enemies reused in each fight means they quickly become very repetitive. All this to get rewards that are either accessories that you won't use because they improve skills that you don't use, or crafting objects that are also useless since crafting is useless. All this to tell a story full of inconsistencies. The side quests are so bad they become a task, a chore. By extension, the monsters we fight again and again in those quests also become a chore. So we try to kill them as quickly as possible rather than engaging in creativity, and pretty quickly we find ourselves doing the same thing with all the enemies in the game, whether we find them in a side quest or in the main ones. It's the same for stories full of inconsistency. The more they go, the more we notice them, and the less what the game is trying to tell us matters, until we lost interest in the whole story. In a way, the hunts act as a magnifying glass on the side quest flaws. They bring diversity to combat and give a reason to explore and pay attention to the world around us, without the incoherent stories. Of course, it's not perfect. The rewards remain not very interesting, the targets are evolutions of other monsters in the game, they are not completely new creatures. Even the explorations part is far from being amazing. The hunts are limited by the game and how it works, but they do their best to give a good experience, and by doing so they make even more visible the failure of the side quest. It's complicated not to see the faults of the quest when you have the hunt contract to compare them with. I think it's sad the game doesn't have more big quests like the hunt because they've chosen to go for quantity instead. But that's only for the side quest, right? It's not like the main quest had the same issue. Right? I say main quest because instead of having one main quest, we follow a series of small quests which, put together, form the main quest. They are represented by a red icon and we can put them in two distinct categories. On one side, there are the real main quest with the dungeon and cool bosses, and on the other side, we have more side quests. If there is one thing I like about the side quests, it's that they are playing fair. The first side quest asks us to deliver 3 meals because the guy who runs the tavern is short-handed, and that's it. That's the quest, and everything is already there. There is the not super interesting action of delivering meals, which is made painful by the fact you can just press the button to deliver them, you have to hold it for 2 seconds. Plus all the coherence problem with that story of a guy who can't manage his shop when there are like 10 customers and he's not even the one who cooks. But he can still pay us 1,000 gil on a chest for 5 minutes of work. Then we have a quest where we need to bring back some wood to the carpenter, which is not much more interesting and raise even more questions about the Hideaway's organization. There is an outdoor quest that asks us to save a woman who was collecting dirt. We find her next to a field where several people are working quietly while not giving a shit about their calls for help.
Quelqu'un a des soucis.
Like, they really don't give a single shit. We fight a few spiders, we collect some dirt, and we go back. Finally, the fourth one is serving food again. That's a very honest introduction to the side quest. We are going to do boring and repetitive stuff with usually an uninteresting story. If you're the kind of person who doesn't play game at 100% completion, you know from the start you can skip this whole part of the game. This is even planned by the game. There are 2 different icons depending on whether the quest has a useless reward like meteorites, or a significant reward like the chocobo or better potions. The side quests are so bad, there is a special icon for the few worth doing. I view that as a huge admission of failure to get to this point. They have been described as side quests worthy of MMORPG in several reviews of FF16, and it's difficult not to have this impression when they got as far as using the same quest icon as FF14. The boring side quest. The boring side quest that unlock something. Things that reinforce me in the idea they were just there to occupy players and increase the game duration without regard over quality. I think that's a completely stupid way of doing things. It's not because side quests are optional that it's okay they sucks. But at least they are optional. Except that, for some reason I don't understand, they decided to take some of those side quests and make them part of the main quest. We are going to talk about them now. If you haven't played the game and want to avoid too many spoilers, it's time to leave. The first one happens when Clive and Jill are on their way to Phoenix Gate. Unfortunately, they have to cross a bridge and it's broken, so we go to see Martha who tells us the carpenter who could have repaired it has disappeared.
Vous voulez dire que vous êtes sans nouvelles?
Exactly, so we go looking for him. We leave the inn, we walk 50 meters and we can see Bernard on a stone surrounded by scorpions. We don't know exactly for how long he's been missing, but it's long enough that Martha is worried about him not coming back, and there is this conversation. One of the town's guards says the bridge will be repaired soon, and a traveler replies that she has been told that for days. So it's probably been several days since the carpenter disappeared, but no one thought to look for him. He left to do maintenance on the bridge that goes from the town to the swamp. It's so close that you can see the bridge from the inn. Yeah, it would have taken 2 minutes to go on the bridge to see if it was okay, Martha. What are you doing? During that time, no one heard him call for help when crossing the bridge, and no one saw him, not even this guy, on town watch, just here. And it's an arch bridge with the 2 abutments embedded in the rock. There are no pylon. Okay, according to Wikipedia it's called a pier. But then, what is he doing underneath without a ladder or anything? Is he doing maintenance just by looking at the bridge? Anyway, we go down the ladder, we kill 3 scorpions, and the quest is over. To be honest, it's probably the worst one. But the others are not that much better. The only interesting thing that come out of it is that they are written with reaction from all the characters in the group, and they often tell more interesting stories. At least more interesting than the majority of the side quests.
C'est une bonne nouvelle.
But they have the same problem of mostly boring fights, of always taking place in the same 3 zones and having cutscenes that look kinda shit, in addition to slowing down the pace of the game. Every time this icon appeared, my first feeling was that the game will be boring for 1 hour before being fun again. On top of that, they don't always fit very well into the main quest, which makes them look quite artificial. I didn't really tell the story with the broken bridge as it happened in the game, but more how I think it should have happened. Because we don't go to the bridge, see that it's broken and go talk to Martha, instead we directly have to go talk to Martha. The dialogue with Jill indicates that the objective is to go to Phoenix Gate.
Clive, il faut y retourner, au Fort Phoenix.
Then Gav tells us that if we had problems, we should go to Martha's Inn.
Si jamais les choses se gâtent pour vous, allez trouver la patronne de l'auberge de Martha.
And it becomes...
L'auberge dont parlait Gab se trouve sur une colline plus loin. Nous allons nous y arrêter.
Okay, it's not as bad as in French, but the quest marker is on the inn, not towards Phoenix Gate, nor towards the bridge. And the quest description specifically tells us that we need to go talk to Martha, not that we are going to Phoenix Gate. All of that so Jill can ask the way when, as we already said, there is only one way. Instead we could have gone to the bridge, seen that it's broken, and then asked Martha for help. This would have given a bit of surprises in the event with a twist. Nothing incredible, but a twist nonetheless, and Jill wouldn't have to look like an idiot by asking for direction when there is only one road to their destination. No, sorry, there is only one road, period. This kind of things makes the story feel very artificial to me.
Oh, vraiment?
Yeah, it is the kind of moment where I have a hard time forgetting that I'm playing a video game. The quest marker doesn't really have any meaning in relation to our objective and removes any possibility of surprise. Although it is unnecessary since we cannot get lost. We have dialogues telling us to go through the village, which is sitting on a big rock, and there is a huge cobblestone road that takes us there. That's sad because it wouldn't have taken much to make this moment more natural. All you need is to reverse 2 events and an option to remove the quest markers. At the start of the game, Clive seeks revenge on his brother's murderer. In this quest for revenge, he will fight and kill Benedicta. Hugo, being in love with Benedicta, takes the news quite badly and swears revenge on Sid, whom he believes is responsible. He will eventually find the location of Sid's hideaway and destroy it, killing countless people. After that, there is a 5-year gap, 5 years during which the survivors of the attack have built a new hideaway where they continue to welcome bearers, while Hugo continues to hunt them down. In case you haven't played the game, bearer are a word that describe all people who can do magic without using a crystal, but who are not able to turn into an icon. They are victims of racism, enslaved, and have a mark on their cheek. The game resumes with Hugo's men setting up a trap for Clive, using bearers as bait.
C'est un piège. Et on ne peut pas dire qu'il soit des plus subtils.
But that does not work and Hugo decides to use some more extreme means. He will attack Rosalith, Clive's hometown, as bait. That works and there is a confrontation between Clive and Hugo. They fight and Hugo gets Jaime Lannisterized before being saved by a cutscene. Then, Gav says that.
Enfin, j'ai pas la moindre idée de ce qui se trame, mais plus on passe de temps à y réfléchir, moins on a de chances de rattraper Kupka.
We go back to the hideaway and I was expecting some action. Everyone working together on a quick but well-made plan, so we could leave for Drexfang in no time. But no, because we have to find Hugo's trail and unfortunately, no one knows where he is. So the game introduces Sid's daughter who is called Mid despite being gorgeous. And we need to help her set up a workshop. We need to go talk to Blackthorn, then we need to talk to Karen, and then we have to find her a carpenter. But unfortunately, all the carpenters are busy.
Tant pis.
So we go back to see Bernard. He asks us to kill a few monsters we already faced between 15 and 20 times so he can access his parents' grave. He will then stay to pray before coming to help us. I have no idea how he finds the hideaway's location since Clive isn't waiting for him and doesn't give him any direction, but to be honest, I don't really care. We go back to Mead and she's very happy.
C'est génial! Merci, Clive.
And we leave for Drake's Fang.
Allons voir comment va Jill.
So we leave for the infirmary where Taria tells us to go to the library to see Gav. There we learn that Torgal is a magical ice wolf because of Shiva's powers. The problem is that doing magic like that without using a crystal causes body petrification. But fortunately, he is immune to that because he eats a lot. I'm not gonna care too much about that explanation and the fact it makes no sense, like why is there a petrification problem if we can just eat a lot and never get sick? Because we are finally going to Drake's Fang, right?
Ah, te voilà! Je t'ai cherché dans tout le repère. Bernard est là. On a besoin de toi vite fait avant de se mettre à bosser.
No, we're going to see Mead because Bernard just arrived, which means he really did walk all the way here 5 minutes behind Clive, but I already talked about that problem earlier. The cinematic fade to black, and finally, we can go talk to Vivian, who explains to us that she still doesn't know where the fuck Hugo is. So we wait until Clive's uncles arrives and the situation finally gets resolved in one of the worst way I can think of. Vivian pulls up a map and explains that the best place to cure Hugo is Drake's Fang.
Quel serait le meilleur endroit pour cacher Hugo Kupka et le remettre sur pied, selon toi? Dans un lieu familier et riche en éther qui permettrait de lui prodiguer les soins magiques nécessaires à son rétablissement. Crodrak, bien sûr, mais comment s'y rendre discrètement?
And then we spend 2 minutes discussing how he got there. Maybe he took a boat, but hey, sea travel is tiring, so he may have crossed the desert instead. It's definitely hotter, but it's shorter. And also, his men on the boat, they were looking downhearted, which has to mean that Hugo was not with them. Well, according to the game, because I can see other explanations as to why an army that lost a lot of men attacking a city only to see their leader lose both his hands could be a little crestfallen. But why would we give a shit about that? Vivian could have told us, right from the start, that Hugo is probably heading back to Drake's Fang. It's not something that requires the spies or whatever to come to the conclusion that they probably took him to the best place possible to heal him. Let's also not forget that their objective is to destroy the crystals, including Drake's Fang, that Hugo's army normally protects. So even if Hugo went somewhere else to get healed, that means he's not protecting the crystal, which means it's the best possible time to attack, instead of asking us to wait for more information while taking the risk of seeing his army return.
Quoi? Tu comptes rester planté là à attendre alors?
Est-ce que ça pose un problème?
This whole sequence is pointless. It's just a waste of time that the game can't even explain properly. What annoys me the most is that this wasted time could have been used to develop the relationship between Clive and Jill, but when Clive goes to the infirmary, he doesn't even take 2 seconds to talk to her. He only asks the dog. It could have been used to show Clive worried about his dog, but he doesn't go ask Harpocrates about Talgor's transformation because he is worried or wants to know more. He goes because Gav asked him to. It could have been used to show how Clive acts as a leader, but instead he just goes where he's told to go. Vivian explains that they are very lucky Clive did not become the Archduke because he would have been a despotic ruler. Okay, so this is the original English translation. As you can see in that version of the game, Vivian does not call Clive a tyrant like in the original version of the game, or a despot like in the French version of the game. Your poor people would surely live in fear of you, can convey the idea of Clive being a tyrant or a despot, but since she does not call him a tyrant, it looked more like a joke about Clive's weird behavior of him just standing next to her waiting. I view this as a good translation decision because it avoids the problems that I'm about to criticize, which is that despotic comes from ancient Greek despot and characterize a leader who rules with absolute power, like a tyrant. But how can she say that Clive would be a despotic ruler when he can't even tell the carpenter to find someone to help Mead?
Tant pis.
Like, I don't know, maybe the one who has nothing else to do than watching his friend work, for example.
Alors, tu penses pouvoir t'en sortir?
Oui, maître. Ça va me prendre encore un petit bout de temps, mais je suis confiant.
Another quest I would like to talk about takes place around the 2/3 of the story. For context, Clive and Jill are in love. The main antagonist has cast a spell that turns the sky in an ugly shade of pink and turns a lot of people into zombies that Barnabas, his henchman, used to attack the town of Kanver. One of his goals being to destroy Clive's will so the main villain can fuse with him. And if you find that a little bit confusing, don't worry, we'll come back to it later. Clive will intervene to save the inhabitants and especially Mead, who is building a new kind of boat in the city's shipyard. Unfortunately, things do not go well. Clive is injured by Barnabas, who cuts all his sinew in a single stroke. Wait, what?
Barnabas a lacéré son corps de part en part avec son épée en épargnant aucun nerf.
Every sinew?
Aucun nerf.
But how could he still walk then? Anyway, this forces Jill to stay back. She too is attacked by Barnabas and she's captured. We have good foundations for a tense moment. Jill is one of the main characters. It's possible you are attached to her. And even if it's not the case, Clive is attached to her. I mean, he should be, but the first thing he says when he hears the news is...
T'en fais pas. Je sais qu'elle va bien.
And Joshua follow up like he perceives the flow of Shiva's ether or some bullshit.
Je perçois encore le flux de l'éther de Shiva.
And okay, why not? But you are ruining the tension of the situation. In a burst of lucidity, Clive tries to get the tension back by saying they have to catch up with Barnabas' boat and save Jill. But no! Our boat is not ready. The new engine is too powerful and could even break the ship. We need to go back to the hideaway in order to find a solution. When we arrive, we have to go talk to Otto and why do we go from this...
Il faut qu'on rattrape l'Aineriar. Jill doit être prisonnière, près du roi.
To this.
Clive? Tu es de retour? Que s'est-il passé à Kanver?
On tient bon, mais c'est une longue histoire.
After that wonderful moment, we search Mid's belongings, we find a clue, we go back to talk about it to Otto, who tells us to go check the orchestrion. 2 children were playing with it. They pressed all the buttons, which caused the piece we were looking for to fall into the machine. Otto confirms that it is indeed Sid's treasure because...
Il me l'avait montré, ça me revient.
And then Taria arrives to talk about something urgent, because Dion ran away. He's a prince that we kind of captured earlier in the adventure, and we don't care at this precise moment, right? It's not like Tarja isn't aware of the situation, since she tells us...
Otto m'a raconté tes déboires à Kanver.
But she had no word for Jill.
En tout cas, tâche de rester en vie, hein?
Oh, thank you, Otto, but why is nobody giving a damn about Jill? Also, in French, Taria asks Clive to go after Dion, but in English, she asks if they should go after him, so maybe she's not asking Clive directly, but referring to people of Clive's resistance. But even with that, when Clive is asked if he wants to go looking for Dion, he answers this.
Non. Il a tout un empire sur ses épaules. Il a sûrement ses raisons.
What is this reason? I was thinking we weren't going to go after Dion because we had to save Jill and there wasn't time for him. But apparently no, the game doesn't give a shit. Who am I supposed to get emotionally involved in her kidnapping when all the game has to offer is people who don't care? And you could think that's not a big deal after all, people have every right to not like Jill. Except the conclusion of this rescue sequence is Clive and Jill who fuck. They are naked on the beach and Clive say...
Le plus grand bonheur que j'ai eu dans la vie, c'est toi, Jill.
So why is there this whole sequence where it's like she doesn't even exist? To top it off, there is nothing interesting in the research of the ship part either. We are just following a quest marker from one soulless cutscene to another to discover a story that doesn't even make sense. You really want me to believe that Sid have specifically built the only cog that Mid wouldn't have the time to build on her own? That this one part would allow all the bot's engine to work? That Mid has made a secret mechanism in order to hide things in the orchestrion? That she wasn't able to understand Sid's clue that Clive found in her stash? That no one ever pressed all the buttons at once before, in almost like 10 years? That the ship part did not fall off during the orchestrion's transfer between the two hideaway, or that Clive didn't see it each time we opened the device to put a new music sheet in? Not to mention the fact that some kids we never seen near the orchestrion decided to play with it at the exact moment we had something to find in it?
C'est une sacrée coïncidence, dis donc!
When the cutscene with Clive, Otto and Taria ends, Clive gets some emotions back and says this.
Je ne peux pas rester ici alors que l'Aineriar continue de s'éloigner. Je dois me dépêcher.
It's nice to see Clive finally getting involved, but what is that? Oh, so they decided to have Clive say he needs to hurry up and at the same time have a pop-up telling us there are new side quests to do? They somehow thought it was a good idea to introduce new side quests in the middle of the hostage rescue sequence. Seconds after the main character say he needs to hurry up and go save the woman he loves. What happened for the game to go from a forced teleport to the hideaway on the way in to unlocking 10 new quests on the way back? This is something the game does a lot. The map opens with all the TP points blocked and a message saying we have to go do the main quest. But a second after the teleportation, you can reopen the map and go wherever you want. What happened in the game's development for that kind of thing to exist? But anyway, We get back, and while Mead is fixing the ship, we have the classic Star Wars reference with the Attack of the Clones. Fortunately, they decided to wait until Clive's return before attacking. We managed to push them back, and we live to catch up with Odin's boat, which also seems to have waited for us to come back from the hideaways before leaving. He's supposed to have the fastest boat in the world, but we go twice as fast as him on foot. One thing I try to do when making these videos is not simply give my opinion on a game, but to give explanations on why I have those opinions and back them up with examples. When you spend time analyzing a game, and by time I mean several months, you will quite naturally start to imagine solutions to improve the part of the game that you found bad or disappointing. But these solutions are not necessarily easy to implement. For example, I think the combat system, despite all its qualities, become too repetitive in such a long game, and I can see 3 solutions for that problem. The first one would be to have more enemy variety. There are hundreds of enemies ideas to take from other Final Fantasy, and having a bigger bestiary would have helped renewing the experience. But creating new enemies is complicated. Even if there are hundreds of ideas for monsters that could be taken from other FF, each one of these ideas will require a huge amount of work. To create a monster, you need to make a 3D model, animations and hitboxes, then you need to balance it, make sound effects, and I think you see where I'm going with this. It's not something you can make in 2 minutes. In the same vein, Akashic monster could have been used to bring novelty to the combat system. They are some kind of magic zombies. They could have had more aggressive behavior than their non-Akashic equivalents. They could also have access to magic attacks, based on the fact that they are full of ether. I think the game really missed an opportunity to improve the combat system by just making them a bluey version of enemies we already know, but as disappointing as it can be, it would have necessitated new moves and new AI for the Akashic to be different, and I don't think that's super easy to do. The second solution, which I have seen mentioned online a lot, would be to have elemental weaknesses and resistance. Some enemies weak to fire or lightning and others who are resistant to those attacks. That would bring a little more strategy into the fights by asking players to choose their abilities based on who they face and not just what they like the most or what deals the most damage. But we cannot equip all the elements at the same time, and we cannot modify our skills during a fight. So if you come across a monster weak to ice and resistant to fire, but you have equipped fire attacks and not ice attack, you are kind of fucked. Because the game has checkpoint during boss fights. If you die against the boss, you restart directly against the boss, and this would need to be changed for a weakness system to work. But there is also the fact that we get access to ice very late in the game, so either there should be no monster weak to ice before the last quarter of the game, or accept there are going to be a lot of monsters with weaknesses we are not able to exploit during the first 3 quarters of the game. Both situations really reduce the interest of having weaknesses in the first place. For that to work, we should have access to ice sooner, but that would mean rewriting the story or being able to play as Jill. 2 things that would have required a lot of work. That doesn't mean the combat system couldn't have more depth. There were things to do to give it more depth, but those solutions would have required a lot of development time. In the case of elemental weaknesses, implementing it would have involved so many modifications, they would have required the dev to work on them from the start of the game's development. To a point that I don't think we would have Final Fantasy XVI with elemental weaknesses, we would have a completely different game. At the beginning, I talked about the fact that after 3 years of development there was a realization that the game's story was too complicated. The best solution would have been to change the story and narration to something more understandable, something that at least the people who make the game understand. But no! That just led to the creation of an encyclopedia, which adds more coherence problems that it resolves. They were not going to rewrite the story to make the game more understandable, just like they were not going to add a playable character so we could use ice sooner. Those are not problems that can simply be solved with the press of a button. That would have represented a lot of work, and work is a lot of money. But that doesn't mean that at least sometimes, simple to implement solutions cannot exist. For example, to prevent the combat from being repetitive, a solution would have been to have fewer fights. I said it before, but there was no need for 90% of the game's quest to have combat, especially with so little enemy variety. I can think of plenty of ways to improve the engine cog search sequence, but none will be as effective or improve the game as much as simply removing it. Because sometimes the solution seems as simple as pressing a button. Merde. Ok. That would obviously require us to modify a little bit other part of the game, but picture this. Clive goes to Kanver, gets smashed by Barnabas, and Jill stays to cover his escape as it already happened in the game. Then it resumes in the shipyard and Clive wakes up. Gav tells him Jill failed to beat Barnabas, and the first change is that there is no "she's fine because I can feel her ether." Like honestly, what is this smelling each other's ethers bullshit? Why neither Clive, nor Jill, nor Sid, nor anyone else felt Phoenix ether for 13 years? Or Ifrit's one for the same time? Why doesn't Hugo seems to feel Benedicta's death? Because it's shit, so that goes away and we can be worried for Jill instead. There is no...
T'en fais pas. Je sais qu'elle va bien.
There is just...
Il faut qu'on rattrape l'Aineriar. Jill doit être prisonnière, près du roi.
To which Mead doesn't say that the bot is missing an engine part, but just that she needs a little bit more time. Something like the Mithril engines need some warm-up, for example. Then Sleipnir attacks, as it's already the case, and we leave. That may not be perfect, and I don't want to sound like it should have been like that. But that resolves the inconsistency with the hideaway trip, and the orchestrion, and the shitty dialogue and cutscenes. That would allow Clive and the player to worry about Jill, making it much easier to get emotionally involved in her kidnappings than when we are told after 5 seconds that there is no reason to worry about. Also, with that mission where we return to the hideaway, the focus is not on the relationship between Clive and Jill, it revolves around the relationship between Sid and Mead. All the possible tension built with the kidnapping is diffused immediately to give way to their relationship. How Mead built the orchestrion, how Sid drew the plan for the boat and made the missing part for his daughter. You must understand, when Barnabas attacks the city with the intent of destroying Clive's will, he doesn't attack to find Jill, he attacked to find Mead, while the only interaction we had with Mead in the game was 2 boring quests. And that the conclusion of the sequence is, I said it again, Clive and Jill having sex. It's the most important moment in their relationship, the moment they stop 5 years of flirting around and finally confess their love. But it's preceded by an hour of the game not giving a single fuck about Jill, having not a single word for her, making the whole sequence artificial, and the game is full of moments like that. Whether we talk about that quest with the boat part research, or the one about finding what route Hugo had taken to go home, or the bridge repair, or the 15 others I haven't spoken about, they all give the same feeling of only being there to make the game longer. They are not very interesting, can sometimes hinder the main story, and don't fit well in the game, in terms of coherence or just in terms of pacing. Even in terms of cinematics, we can differentiate them from the real main quest cinematics in a blink of an eye.
Je suis soulagée. Merci à vous. Heureusement qu'il n'y a pas eu mort d'homme, oui.
Martha, quand les gardiens sont-ils arrivés?
Peu après que Rosalie s'est tombée. Ils sont venus et m'ont prié d'accueillir ceux d'entre eux qui n'avaient plus de logis. Ils s'apprêtaient à partir quand le ciel a changé. Ils sont restés et nous ont offert leur aide.
Martha, alerte! L'équipe de Wed s'est fait attaquer. Ils sont encerclés par des monstres éthériques près du palan. Je crois bien qu'il y a des blessés. Il faut les sauver.
C'est pas vrai.
Laissez-nous faire, Martha.
Occupez-vous des blessés. Il y a des cas graves, alors agissez vite.
D'accord, prenez bien garde à vous.
They look like side quests visually and mechanically, like if they were side quests turned into main quests to make the game longer, or quests added into the game at the last moment with story beats that were not planned when the development started. That would explain the inconsistencies and the lack of care put into them. According to an interview given by Hiroshi Takai and Naoki Yoshida, the director and the producer of Final Fantasy XVI, the main story was initially planned to be around 20 hours, but they added more to it and it finally reached around 35 hours. Which means that approximately 15 hours of content has been added to the story from what was planned. So, on one side, we have around 15 one-hour quests that look like they have been added at the last minute, and on the other side, the main developers explaining there is around 15 hours of content that has been added during development.
C'est une sacrée coïncidence, dis donc!
Maybe those two things are not linked. Maybe these quests were planned from the start and it's something else that has been added. I don't know how the development went on. All I have is one interview, but my conspiracy theory is that someone at Square Enix decided a Final Fantasy game needed to be longer than 20 hours, that it needed to be doubled, and that led to the last minute addition of 15 shitty quests. And if I'm right, This is by far the worst decision made of all development. Because every issue the game has that we have discussed so far is because it's too long. The enemies, the combat mechanics, the exploration, all of that is repetitive, and that wouldn't be the case if the game was half as short. It's the same thing with the game pacing. We have great moments full of action and others that are boring as hell, and that wouldn't be the case without all those main side quests. And finally, all the story inconsistencies those quests bring will not be there if those quests were not there. That would not have solved everything, of course. The real side quests would still be here with all their problem and inconsistency. It's the same with Encyclopedia. But also, all those inconsistencies regarding the story, they are like waves on the sea of issues the scenario is. They just hide the fact that in the middle, there is a giant hole.
Pour que vous puissiez comprendre toute l'étendue de vos transgressions, il faut revenir aux origines.
I'm gonna start with a quick recap. It all started in another world where Ultima lived with his friends. They were happily living their life doing magic until the Blight appeared. This is the name given to a phenomenon of ether depletion in the soil, which makes her sterile and water toxic, destroying the entire ecosystem and leaving only a desolated and black earth, the Deadlands. They then had to sacrifice their bodies to escape their world for Valistea, but they were worried the Blight might reappear, so they developed a plan to eradicate it once and for all. They became the Mother Crystals in order to absorb a gigantic amount of magic and create humanity in order to obtain a body strong enough to wield that magic. Ultima, the only one to remain alive, named the crystals after an ancient legendary dragon in order to facilitate the creation of a new religion, the Circle of Malleus. He then disappeared, leaving the Fallen on their own. The Fallen are the oldest human civilization of Valistea. They evolved using magic and created the Magitech technologies. They then tried to take control over Zemeckis. A war broke out with Ultima that will end up with their defeat, the destruction of Zemeckis and their civilization, and the resurgence of the Blight, in addition to a huge hole in the scenario. Because after that, Ultima's disappeared again. Ultima's friends had to sacrifice their bodies to abandon their world before sacrificing their spirit in the hope of Ultima finding a solution to the Blight. But when Ultima sees humanity has developed a consciousness in his absence, a consciousness which caused the appearance of the Blight in this new world, he decided to disappear again. I don't understand how after everything they've been through, Ultima can just go back to sleep instead of doing everything in his power to regain control over humanity and slow down the Blight as much as possible. They have no plan B, they have already sacrificed everything. There is only him left, he doesn't even have a body anymore, and he does nothing. To me, that doesn't make any sense. There are other things that bother me, of course, like the fact he supposedly needs a body to do magic, but is able to cast a primogenesis spell that screws up the weather and turns half the world into zombie without one. Besides, if he doesn't have a body, why is he represented with a body? There is one moment where he looks like a disembodied being, but the rest of the time it's just a lame Rani cosplay. There is also the fact he needs Clive to absorb the power of every dominant to have a body strong enough for him to merge with. But he tries to merge with Clive as soon as he comes across him in Drake's head. Or maybe he doesn't need Clive to absorb the powers of other dominants before merging with him, he could probably absorb them afterwards. But if that's the case, why did Barnabas give him his powers, which will make Clive stronger and therefore more likely to resist Ultima before they merge together? No matter how you look at that, it doesn't really work. But all that bothers me far less than Ultima being a character who remains in the shadows for 3/4 of the game, and it's not just a question of incoherent story. I think there is something interesting about having the protagonist and the antagonist sharing the same goals. They both want to save the world and their people from the Blight. But the game hiding Ultima's motivation until the end makes him look like a villain who just wants to do evil for the sake of being evil. It's only in the penultimate mission that he finally explains his plan and the fact that he also wants to save the world. This could have led to an interesting discussion, but it happened so late that there is no time for that. When Clive asks
Alors, pourquoi ne pas avoir uni nos forces? Vous aviez le même objectif que nous.
Ultima gives the most cliché I'm a bad guy response possible.
Ce sera notre monde. Après son acte de trahison, l'humanité pécheresse n'y mérite pas de place. Le monde nous appartient et nous ferons ce que bon nous semble de ceux qui s'y trouvent, car tel est l'ordre des choses.
I think he could have been an interesting villain, but that's not the case, because every time he appears, it's to say incomprehensible shit like this.
La conscience. Nous postulons que la volonté humaine est si fragile qu'elle ne peut exister de façon isolée. Vous minorez son inconstance en y entremêlant ce que vous nommez conscience. Nous pensions qu'il suffirait de te débarrasser de ta volonté pour avoir notre réceptacle. Mais il semblerait que nous devons commencer par défaire la trame de la conscience qui la renforce.
Or this?
Si c'est la conscience qui joint ensemble vos volontés, la conscience qui brouille la distinction entre votre volonté et celle des autres, alors nous allons vous séparer à nouveau. Les liens qui vous unissent seront brisés et l'humanité reprendra la place qui est la sienne. Car avec l'expurgation commencera une nouvelle ère de raison.
Mais de quoi est-ce que tu parles?
I wouldn't go as far as saying it makes absolutely no sense, but we are totally in the idea of throwing out complicated things just for the sake of being complicated. Or maybe to hide the fact that, unlike Zemeckis, the story has no depth. During the game, Ultima refers to Clive as Mythos and Logos. Mythos comes from ancient Greek and carries the idea of myth or legend. In the game, that seems to represent Clive as the vessel imagined by Ultima, and by extension, it seems to refer to the idea of destiny. The idea that there is a greater will that governs the course of our lives. Here, it's Ultima that wants to see his will respected to the detriment of Clive's one. Logos, which also comes from ancient Greek, means the language, speech, or also reason, and carries the idea of logic. In the game, it seems to mainly represent free will, the idea that destiny does not exist, and that it is our own will that dictates how we live our lives. Logos is Clive who acts freely without respecting Ultima's will. But that opposition doesn't really exist in the game. There is an opposition between Clive and Ultima, but there is no opposition between myth and reason. The game begins with a memory from Clive where he sees Ifrit kill Phoenix. He spends 30 years as a slave dwelling on this memory without ever thinking that maybe, if he remembers so well how Ifrit killed his brother in a confrontation where there were only 2 people and no witnesses, maybe he is Ifrit? In 13 years, the idea doesn't even seem to have crossed his mind. He is obsessed with his desire for revenge. But despite that, I don't have the slightest idea on how he planned to do it. His plan seems to be to follow orders, hoping that one day the orders will be to kill the guy he wants to kill.
Ça fait 13 ans que j'attends le bon moment.
I think that makes Clive look a little bit stupid, but I'm willing to give the game the benefit of the doubt. After all, Clive transformed into Ifrit because of Ultima. So finding him incapable of making decisions works with that idea of destiny, as if Ultima has successfully destroyed his will. But it's not something that the game highlights. At no time is Clive questioned about his past, so at no time he can express how he felt all this time. This is why I talked about giving the game the benefit of the doubt, because even if there was a desire to have a will-less Clive at the beginning, it's something that is never shown or developed. Even later, when Barnabas wants to destroy Clive's will, there is no reference to the mental state Clive was in at the start of the game, despite the fact that this is how Ultima wants him to be. That's also why I don't think it makes much sense for me to be the target of Barnabas' attack over Kanver. It's when Clive met Jill that he starts to have a will of his own again. He was supposed to kill Shiva's dominant, but he decided to act on his own will for the first time in 13 years when he recognized her. It would make much more sense for Barnabas to target Jill, but when they end up fighting each other, Barnabas is careful not to hurt her while he cuts every sinew from Clive. He takes the risk of paralyzing the body that should become his god vessel, but he is careful to not hurt the person because of whom he resists them. The only explanation I can think of is because Clive needs to absorb Shiva's power before Ultima can fuse with him, but then we circle back to the problem of Ultima trying to fuse with Clive just as they destroy the first crystal. This is also why the relationship between Clive and Jill is so disappointing. This is potentially the most important thing in the game, the main reason for Ultima's failure, but it is told like a secondary love story. In the first discussion between Clive and Jill after the game introduction, she takes his hand and tells him,
Alors je t'aiderai à surmonter tout ça.
Jill...
a hand that Clive takes in return. This scene is here to say there is probably more than friendship between them, and goes well with that idea. She is the reason why Clive feels better. A few hours later, they find themselves sleeping together. They have another discussion and...
Je suis sûre que le destin a voulu qu'on se retrouve.
You can see she's dying for a kiss.
On devrait dormir.
Ouais.
And there is Clive looking at the camera. He looks embarrassed and I find this scene cool. They're cute. But after that, there is a 5-year time gap where nothing happens. There is a scene where Clive and Jill are finally gonna kiss.
Clive, où est-ce que t'es?
But they don't. The scene takes place in the infirmary, like the first time, as if the game wanted to be certain that we are getting the fact that their relationship isn't moving at all.
Je ne veux pas de m'amour sur mon lieu de travail.
And between this and this, there is a quest where they go destroy Drake's breath. But it's only about Jill. Their relationship is not developed at all. The only other moment that shows them close to each other is on the sidelines of a side quest where they have a picnic. And it's so not important, we can choose to flirt with Taria instead.
C'est parti.
And I think we need to talk about Joshua for a second. The thing that destroyed Clive was seeing his brother die before his eyes. He spends the beginning of the game explaining how much he wants revenge. But when he learns his brother is alive, he does nothing. There are 5 years during which neither Clive nor anyone in the resistance that Clive's lead goes looking for him. When they finally reunite, there is a little emotional sequence.
Tu es vivant. On est en vie. Et on s'est retrouvés. Je n'avais jamais pensé pouvoir te revoir un jour.
And that's all. He doesn't ask him what he did for the past 18 years, how he feels, who's this girl he traveled with, or why didn't he try to warn him that he was alive. Nothing. There is nothing. And when Clive says this,
Je n'avais jamais pensé pouvoir te revoir un jour.
Did it never occur to him that maybe he could look for his brother or something? After that, they both go on an adventure, and Joshua leaves the first chance he got, because he wants to search a castle that may have clues about Ultima's nature, and Clive doesn't care. He could have told him that no, they've already spent too much time away from each other, he's going with him. He's the first Shield of Rosaria after all, taking care of his brother is his job. But no, Clive just say,
D'accord. Mais sois prudent.
Their relationship is even emptier than the one he has with Jill. Those are the two most important relationships in his fight between Ultima's will and Clive's will. And they are treated as unimportant side relationship, which turn all the game's discussion about will secondary and unimportant. Rather than doing something interesting, they try to sweep the misery under an ancient Greek rug. As if I was trying to sound clever saying it's all a bit co-pros, instead of just saying it's shit. At the beginning of the game, after Clive gets his will back, he decides to go on a quest to destroy the Mother Crystals. Sid indicates they are the reason things are dire. Clive has some doubts at first.
Tu divagues.
But Sid explained he did his own research.
Ça fait des années que j'étudie la question, et crois-moi, je suis maintenant certain de la réponse.
And if they have always been told the mother crystals are beneficial, it is because of a conspiracy.
La vérité dérange. Alors on veut nous faire croire tout ça.
Tu fais allusion à qui, au juste?
Aux dirigeants, aux dieux eux-mêmes.
And that's enough to convince Clive, even after destroying several crystals and seeing the situation continue to get worse, to the point where we can see the Blight progress the second we destroy the Dominion's crystal. They will never question Sid research. When Ultima explained it is the wars and the use of magic that are responsible for the Blight, Clive rejects the information immediately. He refused to think about it.
Tu fais porter la faute aux hommes. Tu prétends que notre éveil a provoqué le fléau noir?
Notre faute. Non. Non, nous n'y sommes pour rien. C'est toi le responsable de tout ça.
Okay, so those subtitles are not the actual English translation in the game. Those are. In the English version, they talk about Ultima's hypocrisy and inability to see that he's far more closer to humanity than he thinks, which I think is more interesting. That's also more accurate to the original version, and all the versions I managed to check. The French adaptation of this game kinda sucks, to the point that I had to remove a few paragraphs here and there when I realized it was just the French adaptation making no sense at time, and yeah, I'm pausing the English version of the video to rant about the French version of the game. What a mess. And I'm not blaming the team that did the adaptation, it's this game after all, no wonder they miss a few points. If I'm talking about it instead of just removing that part from the video is because, on one hand, I want you to know where I'm coming from. This is the shit Clive say in the game I've played and I can't unsee it. But it's also because, on the second hand, I don't think that invalidates the conclusion I'm going to reach in a few seconds. Because even without that line, I think Sid is presented as a conspiracy theorist that Clive follows blindly. He's portrayed as a guy who will watch 2 YouTube videos about chemtrails and decide he needs to destroy Airbus and Boeing factories. And to me, that's no Logos, that's stupidos. Or should I say, koalemos. It could have been a story about a character who loses his will, someone ready to let Ultima create his world without humanity after everything he has experienced. Clive spent 13 years as a slave in a world where slaves are not even allowed to speak. Before that, his mother tried to kill him at the same time she tried to kill his brother and his father. Jill was kidnapped and possibly killed following an attack that destroyed his hometown. There was everything for Clive to be a melancholic character who's lost hope in humanity. Ultima's perfect vessel. Reuniting with Jill could have been the start of a long journey for Clive where he tries to escape depression. But instead, reuniting with Jill solved everything, and instead of this opposition between Mythos and Logos, all we have is an opposition between Ultima's will and Sid's will. The free will of Clive, this famous Logos, is so important that Clive abandons it to become Sid. He literally takes his name and his quest. Even some encyclopedia entries use the name Sid for things that Clive did. It makes the game unnecessarily complicated, on top of being meaningless. His free will only uses this to choose who he will blindly follow, without ever demonstrating the slightest logic. At the end of the game, Ultima explains he comes from another world, and he tells Clive he is going to be in Origin. In the next scene, when we return to the hideaway, Clive says this.
Comme vous pouvez vous en douter, c'est Ultima qui a fait apparaître le cristal sombre qui vole dans le ciel. Il l'a appelé le Provenance. Mais la signification de ce nom m'échappe. Du moins pour le moment.
This is the name of the ship they used to come. It is called Origin because they originate from it. It represents their origin in that world. How is this possible not to understand that? But it's not just that Clive doesn't understand, it's that the game takes great care to show us that Clive doesn't understand. Clive is branded, more like branded, am I right? These jokes only work in English, I hope you like it. And I don't understand why they decided to have him say that while talking about him as Logos. And Clive being stupid is a problem that pollutes all the other things of the game. Like for example, vengeance. The whole game seems to revolve around revenge. Clive wants to avenge his brother's death, then he wants to avenge the death from Sid Zideaway's destruction. Jill wants to avenge the children sacrificed by the Patriarch of the Iron Kingdom, and avenge herself for everything he forced her to do. Hugo wants to avenge Benedicta's death, and even Ultima seems to want revenge on humanity after the Fallen's war. Towards the end of the game, Clive, Gav and Joshua save Edda, a pregnant young woman. Everyone in her village has been transformed in zombie, including her husband. She is the only survivor, presumably because the child she carries is a bearer whose power would have protected her from Ultima's influence. When Clive returns after defeating Barnabas, she realizes that the entire village, including the father of her child, are dead.
Alors, les autres sont morts.
After 20 seconds of silence, Gav says this.
C'est triste, mais Clive les a vengés. Barnabas a payé, il est mort. C'est dur, je sais.
I don't want to criticize Gav here. At least he tried to say something to comfort her, unlike Clive and Joshua. But of all the things he could have said, he thought about revenge. This theme is omnipresent in the game, but despite how much time the game spent talking about revenge, he doesn't have anything interesting to say about it. I think what shows it best is Hugo's arc. As I said, he wants to avenge Benedicta's death. That will lead him to attack Sid's hideaway, killing a lot of people. But Sid was already dead at that point. That prevents Hugo from truly avenging himself. But since Clive decides to take Sid's name, Hugo thinks he may still get some revenge by killing him and a person he loves. With that in mind, he attacks Rosalis and manages to capture Jill. This is the first time she is in danger, and it worked much better on me than the second one, because Clive worries about her hideaway and goes to save her as quickly as possible.
Où est Jill? Dans la cour d'honneur.
Merde. Dépêchons-nous.
I also really like how Gav got to the left on the screen despite the wall. At first he go left, but it stopped like, fuck, it's not the right way, and he turned back. But it's just to give us back her sword, and he goes straight into the wall in a beautiful analogy of the scenario. I like Gav. He's one of the rare characters in the game who isn't too dark and brings some good humor. He's not even afraid to make jokes from time to time, like when he tells Clive that the magic handcuffs are super hard to open.
Les entraves de cristal sont impossibles à ouvrir, tu sais. Enfin, je veux dire, impossible sauf pour moi.
Which must be a joke, because 2 minutes later, Clive has no problem removing Jill's handcuff. Following Jill's rescue, we finally have a confrontation with Hugo. He explains that Clive shattered his dream because he wanted to dominate the world with Benedicta.
Oh, on avait un rêve! J'aurais pu être le roi de ce monde! Elle aurait pu être ma reine! Et tous les deux, on aurait régné de droit divin! Mais tu as tué ce rêve! Tu l'as gâché à jamais!
Something that come out of nowhere. I mean, there is nothing in his behavior that indicates he wanted to become king of the world. He is not even king of his country. And it's not like he needs Benedicta to take power. He is one of the most powerful men in the world. And I'm not just talking about the fact he can transform into a huge creature that could destroy a house just by walking on it. He also has a lot of influence. He has an army at his service, and he controls the main source of magic crystals in Dalmatia. If he had wanted to take power, he could have done it a long time ago. But instead, he seems happy to just be a counselor. We see him ignoring order and putting himself in danger to defend his country from the Iron Kingdom. And he refuses to fight against Bahamut in the Dominion because that might lead to the town being destroyed and innocent people being killed. That's why that dream of becoming king of the world comes out of the blue. It doesn't fit the character at all. Until that point, the game has shown us someone reasonable. The only moment when he acts like a bad guy is when he seeks revenge. On Clive, who kills a woman he loved. This could have been an opportunity to confront Clive, to make him face his own actions and contradiction, to have a discussion about revenge. But instead we are told that Hugo wants to be king, so we can put him in the bad guy box and avoid doing any more thinking. After that, they fight. Clive wins, but Hugo is saved, and there is a waste of time sequence where Vivian tries to find out which route he took to get home. At this point, revenge becomes the main quest. We don't go to Drake's Fang to destroy the crystal, we go there to kill Hugo. After a fight that seemed a little bit too long to me, Hugo dies and Clive destroys the crystal with a power that we will unfortunately never have the chance to use ourselves. Which is a shame, since, as I said earlier, a few more moves when we play Ifrit would have been appreciated. But anyway, after that, the group gathers around Sid's grave, and Clive says this.
Quand les gens ne veulent pas écouter, alors il vaut mieux simplement se taire.
Which relates to the same thing said by Sid earlier in the game.
Quand les gens veulent clairement pas écouter ce qu'on a à dire, autant fermer sa bouche et économiser sa salive.
But when Sid talks about people not wanting to listen, he's not just talking about Clive, he's also talking about Benedicta, a woman he thought he could help but who ended up rejecting what he had to say. He realized that he was forcing his way of seeing the world on her and that it was useless. Hence this sentence, if no bugger want to listen to what you've got to say, you might as well keep your gob shut. Which makes a big difference with Clive, because although he appropriates Sid's sentence, at no point does he try to discuss anything with Hugo. Clive tells him that he killed his crush and that he doesn't care if that hurted Hugo because Hugo also has hurt people.
Toi, c'est toi qui l'as tué.
Oui.
There is no reason to listen to someone talking like that about the fact he killed the woman you loved. And before that discussion, they only interact once, a few minutes earlier, when Hugo captures Jill and Clive say,
Laissez Jill en dehors de ça. Ferme-la.
And finally,
Merde.
And when we find him at Drake's Fangs for the final confrontation, Clive doesn't even have the opportunity to speak to him before attacking him in the back. Hugo does not refuse to listen to Clive. Clive has nothing to say. This guy here? It's Quentin. He is the leader of Lost Wing Village, and he seeks revenge on the former Justice Minister of Sunbreak who killed his family.
Il m'a tout pris. Ma famille. Mon bonheur. Ma position.
We will do some side quests for him and for the village, until he tells us that he created this village in order to recruit an army to wreak his revenge.
Une idée me vint alors à l'esprit. Une idée folle. Pour le trouver, il me fallait une armée à mes ordres. Et c'est ici, à la nef, que je recrutais bon nombre de guerriers sensibles à ma cause.
Army that he will lead to death when he decides to put his plan into action, after which he says this.
Et ce plan, construire un village ici, libérer les pourvoyeurs de leur chaîne et finalement les rallier à ma cause. Et tout ça pourquoi? Tout ça pour... ça? Un massacre. Tout ça est d'une tristesse. Sacrifier des dizaines d'hommes pour se venger d'un seul.
Finally, the game lays some criticism at revenge. Quentin got revenge, but he seems to have lost far more than he gained. He looks like he is at the end of his rope. It's almost like he had hoped to die in the attack.
Quentin, est-ce que ça va?
Non.
When we talk to the few people who stay behind on a small farm because they were too weak to fight, one of them told us that,
Une fois assouvi son besoin de vengeance, je ne pense pas qu'il voudra continuer à vivre.
after the attack, there is another flood in the village, some kind of magical miasma that turned people into zombies. And Quentin rushed in as if he was afraid some people may have been trapped in the village, even though we know there is no one left, since we make sure to evacuate the city before the attack. But rather than criticizing the game for yet another inconsistency, I will recognize that even if Quentin doesn't have a rational reaction, since he is rushing toward his own end, this is a reaction that makes sense from someone who seems to have lost any will to live after causing the loss of everyone he lived with. But after that, the game gets its shit together. While Quentin is still covered in blood and continues to express suicidal intentions,
Je ne vois pas pourquoi continuer à vivre à présent.
the few survivors start explaining they still want him as their leader. He is like a father to them. It's almost like if they are disappointed not to have been able to die for him. It doesn't really matter that he led 30 people to death for a revenge that brought him nothing, because he did it with good intentions. And that's enough for him to be happy again. There is a character with suicidal impulses in the game, and it's treated with so much care and attention that he just needs a pat on the back from a friend to tell him it's gonna be okay, to be happy again. That, like the remorse he had over his revenge, are presented as a passing feeling.
Rebâtir le village. Après tout, ça vaut mieux que de se laisser mourir.
The game even goes further by making him the voice of the Triunity. At the end of the game, Clive's uncle, a very wealthy merchant, and the leader of the Dalmatian armies create an alliance to help the population. The plan is for Clive's uncle to bring money while the army leaders bring soldiers in order to help the population dealing with the Blight and the Akashic. But they need an ambassador, someone to represent them to the commoners and world leaders, in order to convince them of their initiative's benefits. Among all the characters of the game, Quentin is the chosen one. And he's chosen immediately. Clive doesn't end up choosing him after a long reflection, which isn't surprising coming from someone who doesn't seem capable of long reflection anyway, but he learns that he needs a charismatic person capable of being respected by rich and poor alike, and he immediately thinks, oh, I should ask the guy who led his entire village to death. The game could have talked about vengeance, about the risk of vengeance bringing more vengeance, the collateral damage that affects innocent people, or that it doesn't necessarily help people get better. They were foundation for that kind of discussion. Hugo's vengeance begins because of Clive's vengeance, but the fact that Clive shed the first blood is never even mentioned. Innocent people die during the Hideaway or Rosalie's attack, but all those dead people are barely mentioned in the game. The cutscene where the Hideaway's people die is barely over, but we are already 5 years later. The bodies are still warm, but we've already moved on. They don't give a shit so much about the Hideaway's members who died during Hugo's attack that the only grave they visit after he dies is the grave of Sid, the only guy from the Resistance who wasn't killed by Hugo. And then there is Mead, who runs away after Hugo's death to avoid visiting her father's grave. She could be running away because she can cope with her adoptive father's death. It's probably the second time she lost her parents. She had every right to be sad. This could have been a way to talk about revenge and grief in addition to Mead's relationship with Sid. But no, she just leaves because she wants to build her ship. What could have been a touching moment become an embarrassing joke fest. I'm mostly saying that because of the French version. The English one doesn't have that many jokes. If you look at the French subtitles, every word written in italic is an untranslatable boat joke. And sadly, I wasn't able to find if the sequence was supposed to be funny or not in Japanese. But even if the English version has less jokes, it's still not talking seriously about why Mead might not want to visit her father's grave. The only moment where the game addresses the subjects of collateral damage or the lack of relief that revenge can bring, it's with Quentin, and it's resolved in 2 minutes with the survivors telling him that doesn't matter. The whole revenge thing is just an excuse to have a villain in the first half of the game, before Ultima really comes into play. And it's handled in the most Manichean way possible, with no regard for people's actions and their consequences. Quentin, like Clive, are part of the good guys, regardless of the number of deaths for which they are responsible. Since they are part of the good guys, these deaths are necessarily justified. There is no reason to question their actions. Quentin is even rewarded for his revenge. He becomes the voice of an alliance that seeks to save the world. He represents the hopes of a world united in solidarity. Hugo is not so lucky. He is a bad guy, so nothing can excuse or even explain his actions. He just deserves to die. When Hugo explains that Clive destroyed his dream, the only thing that Logos has to answer is that Hugo too destroyed dreams.
Et vous alors? Combien d'hommes avez-vous tué? Combien de rêves avez-vous brisés? Vous êtes loin d'être la seule personne à avoir perdu un être cher, vous savez. Je n'ai aucune pitié pour vous, Kupka. Vous ne méritez aucune pitié!
This is the most insipid answer possible. Like Clive, this is just stupid. And you may want to say to me that it's normal if it's not super well written. Even if everything seems to revolve around revenge, the game is not trying to say anything about revenge. It's not really a theme, it's more like a tool the game uses to move the story forward and try to bring more depth. Ultima doesn't want to kill humanity because he is a villain, he wants to do it for revenge. It's bad, but it's just a video game. And this is kinda true. It's sad they made a game where everything revolves around revenge without having anything to say about revenge, but in the end it's just a video game using a very cliché element to move the story forward instead of good writing. There is nothing new here. No need to spend an hour on that. The real reason I talk about that is because the people that wrote Final Fantasy XVI, they didn't stop there. they decided to talk about other subjects, like climate change, racism, and slavery. There are two types of person in Final Fantasy XVI. Normal people who need a crystal to perform magic, and the one who don't. On one side you have the dominants. They can use their bodies as crystal to do magic, but can also store ether within their body, which allows them to transform into icons like Clive, Joshua, Jill, Benedicta or Hugo. On the other side, you have those who are not able to transform, but can still perform magic using their bodies as crystals. They are called bearers, and they are forced into slavery. Long before the game began, bearers were free and they were worshipped and adored for their ability to perform magic. But the different country leaders on both continents felt threatened and decided to oppress the bearers and their followers until a war broke out. They slaughtered them all and blamed them for the bloodshed, using this war and inventing a deluge of blood depths as a pretext to enslave the bearers in a system that still persists at the start of the game. An extremely violent system that goes as far as to prohibit considering bearers as human beings.
Allez, chauffez-moi ça. C'est pas avec un feu aussi faible qu'on pourra faire fondre quoi que ce soit.
Their bodies act as crystal, and as crystals they are considered. They are used for their ability to perform magic, and like the crystals that shattered after too much use, bearers slowly petrified until they finally die.
On les oblige à se servir de leur pouvoir. Chaque jour, sans relâche. Avec le temps, leur corps se pétrifie entièrement, et ils finissent par être abandonnés.
It is an extremely violent representation of slavery based on racism. But despite that, the game does not treat those subjects with any more depth than the previous one. At the start of the game, Clive is part of a squad of branded soldiers. They seem so efficient, their mission is to kill a dominant, and immediately that brings a lot of questions. How does the Empire manage to have such confidence in them that they are sent on mission without supervision? It's not a good idea to give weapons to prisoners, even less so when they are prisoners with military training and magical powers. How do they make sure they won't rebel at some point? The military training of those slave soldiers must cost some money, especially compared to slaves with just used to make fire for a forge or some wind to dry laundry. Are they treated like the other bearers, or does that make them more important? These are just a few questions that come to my mind without too much thought, and I think trying to answer those questions would have led to some interesting discussions about slavery and bearers' lives. But the persons who make the game probably don't want to bother with those kind of discussion, since at the end of the intro the branded soldiers disappear from the story without any explanation. We are introduced to Sid, who explains he wants to free the slaves.
J'essaie juste de les sauver. Les émissaires comme elle, et les marqués comme toi.
Which he does by offering them refuge in his hideaway, a place where they can live and die as free men.
Sid, je repense à une chose. Tu disais vouloir créer un endroit où les gens pourraient mourir comme des êtres humains normaux.
C'est vrai.
Quand on y réfléchit, tu veux dire un endroit où les gens pourraient vivre comme ils le veulent.
But this is where things get weird. Because this moment where Clive decides to join Sid in fighting against slavery coincides with the moment where they decide to stop freeing the slave, in order to destroy the Mother Crystal and stop the Blight.
Ton but n'était pas de sauver les émissaires et les pourvoyeurs?
C'est toujours le cas. Je compte pas renoncer à cette partie du projet. Mais si on laisse faire les choses, les cristaux mères vont changer le monde en terre morte. L'humanité est en danger, et on n'a plus le temps de convaincre. Il faut foncer et agir avant qu'on soit tous morts. Ensuite, on pourra créer ce fameux endroit où les gens peuvent vivre en paix comme ils l'entendent.
I understand the argument that the priority is to save the world before saving some of its inhabitants. But I think it's a bad idea to use that as an excuse to relegate slavery and racism to something secondary. As I said earlier, the Blight is a name given to a phenomenon of depletion of ether in the soil. Earth becomes sterile, the water becomes toxic, and the entire ecosystem collapses. It is a threat that is present throughout the game and weighs on the entire world. The Blight is a way for the game to talk about the environment, and it's something that I've barely seen discussed around the game. And every time I saw people discussing it, it was to talk about climate change, whereas even if I can clearly see how to draw parallels between the use of crystal and their effect on Final Fantasy XVI worlds and the use of fossil fuels and their impact on our world, For me, the game doesn't speak so much about fossil fuels danger as it talks about the danger of nuclear energy. The blight remind me of nuclear exclusion zones like the one at Chernobyl or Fukushima, and the dominants make me think of atomic bombs. They are almighty creatures whose powers are beyond measurement. If you can hope to beat a dominant, there is nothing that can stop his icon. No weapon nor magic come close to matching them. Their invocations are powerful enough to kill people. Right at the start of the game, at Phoenix Gate, they are presented as weapons of mass destruction, the castle being almost completely destroyed in the fight. The destructive powers of Icon also represent a big risk for civilian population and make them difficult to use for an attack. They are presented as a deterrent force.
Même si j'allais me battre, nos ennemis enverraient Bahamut, deux primordiaux qui se déchaînent, autant vous dire que les îles de la Croisée en souffriraient. Au lieu de libérer le Dominion, vous le condamneriez à la destruction. Est-ce là vraiment ce que vous désirez?
And for those reasons, I see them as an allegory of nuclear weapons, and by extension, the ether which allows them to transform seems to be an allegory of nuclear energy. And that's not surprising coming from a Japanese game, the only country in the world to have been hit by nuclear bombs and a nuclear accident. It also makes me think of the ecological vision of FF7, where again, the Mako seems to be an allegory of nuclear power far more than fossil fuels. One of the biggest regrets of Barrett, the character most involved in the fight against the use of Mako, is having convinced his village they should stop mining and using coal. And in the movie Advent Children, which takes place 2 years after the end of Final Fantasy VII, he is happy to find oil. You know, elements that doesn't make much sense in a speech against climate change, but which do not pose too many problems in an anti-nuclear speech. We can see very clearly the effects that the Blight has on the world, with flows of refugees who live in poverty, having difficulty finding housing or even food, in areas that are increasingly more dangerous due to an increasing number of monsters, because wildlife is also fleeing the Deadlands. I think it's a clever idea to link the presence of monsters to the destruction of the environment. The game talks about indirect effects that the death of an ecosystem can have on humans that we might not necessarily imagine at first glance, but which are very present in environmental issues. And yes, there is little chance we find ourselves fighting against packs of wolves because of global warming in a real world, but we can draw a comparison with the increased number of cases of Buruli ulcer, a disease similar to leprosis, in tropical areas affected by deforestation. Destruction of the forest increases the sunshine in swamps and their water temperature, making them unlivable for fish that tend to disappear. Fish which normally eat the various mollusks or insect larvae carrying the disease. So they thrive and multiply, and the risk of infection increases for human or animal populations. And that's just an example that I found while making research for that video. Because that's the kind of stuff you only heard about if you are really interested in the matter. You don't hear about the indirect side effect of the collapse of an ecosystem in a lot of media, let alone games. So I was happily surprised to see that in FF16. That probably means this was an important theme for the people making the game and that a lot of care goes into it. Right? Well, no, of course not. As good as this example can be, it's the only one. If you wonder how much they were not caring about all that, you need to look no further than this scene. Clive and Jill are talking about the Deadlands and how no plants can grow there.
Des terres mortes à perte de vue.
Et elles sont si près du village.
Plus aucune plante ne peut pousser. Le sol a perdu presque tout son éther. Dès lors que la terre est comme ça, on ne peut plus rien cultiver. Plus de plantes, plus d'animaux, plus de vie.
And Clive says that while standing next to some plant in the Deadlands. All the problem in the game revolve around that simple fact. The blight makes the soil sterile. No plant can grow in the Deadland. This is so important that even the existence of Ultima in that world is because of that. But somehow, they decided to put grass in the places where no grass can grow. And it gets even worse. At the end of the game, Clive goes to Ash. You can see the monolith surrounded by the blight on the map, and you can stand next to it. And whatever the direction you decide to look at, you will see grass. And it's green. why is this a thing? I know the devs were kinda lost in their own story, but to that point? What happened? Anyway, one thing I found cool is that they tried to think about what a world with magic would look like. In a game like Final Fantasy X, for example, there is magic and everyone is able to do magic, at least all the members of our group can, but magic never seems to be used in daily life. In FF10, magic is something you use to fight monsters. In FF16, magic is used in daily life. People use fire spells to power their forge. They have magic water dispensers instead of well, that sort of thing. And I think that was an important thing to add in a game about dependence over an energy whose use returns to destroy the world. In an early part of the game, I noticed a slave who was drying laundry using his power to make wind. At first, I was thinking this was completely stupid. Why waste resources on drying laundry when you could just wait for the real wind and sun to do the work? And then I realized there are a lot of people who can dry their laundry outside but prefer to use a dryer. And I went from finding this situation stupid to seeing it as a fair critique of our society. By using magic as an analogy for our energy and showing the use of magic in people's daily lives, the game draws a critique of our use of energy in our daily lives. Except, the game limits the use of magic to very basic things. Magic is used to dry laundry or not having to fetch water from the river or to dig a well. I mean, even when Hugo loses his hands and is sent to Drexfang because he needs a place full of magic to be cured, they just give him prosthetics. The advantage is that it makes it very easy to solve the problem in the game. Magic is presented as something easily replaceable, and it is easily replaced. The main consequences to the end of using magic that the game shows us is blacksmiths having to learn to use bellows to fuel their forges. The game seems to be about the danger of nuclear power and that we need to stop using it, without ever being interested in the consequences it will have on the world. Because in the world of Final Fantasy XVI, stopping using magic has no consequences. The game has an extremely simplistic approach to the environmental issue, and that prevents it from saying anything interesting on the matter. And even if you think that magic is not used to critique our society, and I should stop seeing politics everywhere, that still poses problems with regard to the story. We are told that magic is a resource so precious that men have been at war for thousands of years over its control.
Les cristaux mères, qui trônaient aux quatre coins du monde, avaient guidé les hommes vers la prospérité. Mais le désir et l'envie naissant en eux finirent par troubler leur cœur.
But then, all it takes is one bellow made of dragon skin to obviate the need for fire magic. How is magic precious? It's kinda the same thing when the game discusses why there is a blight. There are two explanations. Sid's version that blames the crystals.
Tout ça, c'est parce que les cristaux mères épuisent les terres du sol autour d'eux.
And Ultima's version that blames humanity that uses magic and does war.
Recherchant ce que seule la magie pouvait offrir, il a multiplié les conflits et tué les siens pour contrôler cette précieuse ressource. Ce crime couvrit la terre d'un manteau noir.
I was expecting Ultima to be right, that the blight was a consequence of human action, that the world was indeed dying because of the use of magic and constant war, because that would have made sense with what seems to be the game theme. But no, they killed Ultima explaining he was wrong. Ultima is the one responsible for the blight because of the crystal. Humanity using them is not. But then, what's the message? What are you trying to say? We have what look like a criticism of humanity's impact on the environment, but then humanity has nothing to do with it. It's all because of a god no one remembers. As if the message was, yeah, global warming and nuclear powers are bad, but it's all Zeus' fault. Humanity that burns the oil or throws the bombs have nothing to do with that. Like if they planned to say something interesting, to do a real critique of our world and then backdash at the last minute. And so, this is how the game treats the themes that justify putting slavery and racism aside. So let's go back a little, after this scene where Sid explains the priorities to destroy the Mother Crystal.
Ton but n'était pas de sauver les émissaires et les pourvoyeurs?
We go to destroy Drake's head and there is a 5 years ellipse. The game resumes with Clive and Jill trying to free a group of slaves used as bait by Hugo's army, and they are not very well received.
Rentre chez toi. Nos camarades sont morts et c'est ta faute. Tu comprends? Nous avons servi d'appât pour t'attirer hors de ta cachette de lâche, alors que toute cette histoire ne nous regarde pas.
I don't really understand what's happening. Well, no, I totally understand that the bearers who already have a miserable life are not particularly happy to see it is becoming even worse. What I don't understand is, why didn't they come to Clive's hideaway? That seems to be the goal of the mission. But instead of telling them they can come and they will be safe under the protection of the Cursebreaker and two dominants, Clive just say,
Pardonnez-nous.
And they each go their separate ways. The quest that follows involves the Black Shields. It is an official organization that aims to track down and exterminate bearers and those who protect them. We end up killing their leader and they disappear from the main quest, like the slavery theme that is never gonna be discussed in the main quest ever again. Slavery disappears so much from the main quest, even Clive no longer has his tattoo slave on his cheek. Instead, he has a huge scar that no one finds suspicious. He stopped being branded. I don't think it's a very good idea to add ethnic cleansing on top of all the other problems already mentioned just a few minutes before relegating it all to the side quest. Like, for real, who thought it would be a good idea to start the game with one of the most violent depictions of slavery I ever seen in a work of fiction? I decided to make it a secondary thing? Because yes, the slavery's representation is extremely violent. Slaves are considered as tools and not as men. And by that I mean it is against the law to view them as men. They are not allowed to speak without permission. They are barely fed. They can be executed for looking at a person or even just for fun. There is a woman who just gave birth explaining she handed her newborn to the authorities because he showed signs of magic. This is why I also talk about racism. Slaves are slaves because they are bearers, and all bearers are slaves, from birth. They are placed in orphanage where they are subject to all kinds of violence that kill many of them. They are tattooed with an ink made from Riventail, a poisonous plant that should kill them if they try to remove their brand. They are sold and can be used as tool for making fire for a blacksmith, as much as being used as dummy to train the army's monsters. And for those who manage to hide their magic capability and remain free, there is the risk of being discovered one day and being put to death by your former friends. It is truly difficult to have a more violent depiction of slavery and racism than what's depicted in the game. But I will give that to the game. At least the theme is present in the side quest. My problem is that most of them are here to show how awful slavery is, but almost none of them are about stopping slavery. Almost like if the game doesn't really want to talk about that. The quest that show it best happens near the end of the game, when Clive is asked to find a book that has been lost through time. But using the powers of quest markers, we find it in a few minutes. It's in that book that we learn about the Deluge of Blood, the war that happened between the world leaders on one side and the bearers and the people that followed them on the other. That's the justification for their slavery. But the book doesn't frame the bearer as responsible for what happened, as if the debt put on their kind was a pretext more than anything else. The Deluge of Blood seems to be the cornerstone of the racist ideology present in the game, but it's revealed to us at the very end, in a side quest, so it can be linked to the main quest since it's the end of the game already. Like if, once again, the plan was to never take any risk of saying something interesting. Right after we find the book, a guy shows up out of nowhere, something NPC do a lot in the game. We fight, and he asks Clive what he thinks about the book.
Il narre ce honteux tournant de notre histoire, quand la majorité des faibles s'est alliée contre la minorité des puissants. Que penses-tu de la façon dont il interprète l'histoire? Te paraît-elle juste?
I think that's interesting, because from what I understand from the English version of the book, the bearer, the gifted few, kind of deserved it. The English adaptation of the book had a lot compared to the French or Japanese version. There is this whole paragraph about the bearers being in position of power in the society, but then starting a church where they cast themselves as God, and that was little too much for the king, so they ask them to stop, and they say no, so they force them to stop, and that's where the oppression starts and lead to the war. That's not how it is in French, which seems far closer to the Japanese version, but I don't really speak Japanese, so. Anyway, what the book says doesn't really matter. What matters is the interpretation. And I wonder what Clive's interpretation will be.
Aucune idée.
Ladies and gentlemen, Logos! When I say Clive being dumb pollutes the game, I think of that kind of thing. He leads a resistance group fighting for the freedoms of slaves. Before that, he was a slave himself. But he somehow doesn't know what to think about all that. He is clueless? That's so stupid. Even the other guy can't help but laugh at him.
Aucune idée. Tu philosophes moins bien que tu ne croises le faire.
And then he disappeared the same way he appeared earlier.
Reste où tu es. Aussi insaisissable que mystérieux, ces exécuteurs.
Ladies and gentlemen, cinema! But I want to ask, is Clive being dumb what makes the game unable to say anything interesting with all its theme? Or is it because the game doesn't want to say anything interesting that Clive is dumb? There is one last quest I would like to mention. The one named Line in the Sand, in which the town of Dalimil found that Lubor is a bearer. Lubor? It's him. He is a talented blacksmith, not very surprising, friend of the resistance, and he managed to unify the different groups of people in the city to create a militia against raiders. Thanks to that, he was expected to become the new town leader, until a group of raiders attack and threaten two children that Lubor will save using magic without using a crystal.
Ça risque de chauffer pour mon matricule.
With that, the village learns he is a bearer, and people wonder whether they should execute him or not. Well, not really. The village is supposed to be full of good people, so even when they start stoning him, it's not to kill him, it's just to make him leave.
Casse-toi d'ici!
Fortunately, the two children that Lubor saved intervene. They take a few stones to the face, and that triggers the villagers. They realize they completely lost their shit.
Vous voulez le chasser de Dalimil, alors qu'il a toujours tout fait pour nous aider.
And that's enough. All it took to stop them from being racist was two kids to tell them racism is wrong. And it's not like the villagers decided to leave Lubor alone, like, hey, you can continue being a blacksmith if you want, that's cool. No! He becomes the new town leaders, and they agree on banning slavery.
Les Dalimilois devront cesser de discriminer les pourvoyeurs qui vivent ici. Je veux qu'ils soient traités de la même manière que les autres habitants. J'ai toujours fait tout ce que je pouvais pour Dalimil, et même si pendant un temps vous n'avez vu en moi qu'un pourvoyeur, vous avez fini par accepter de considérer à nouveau mes qualités propres. Et je ne suis pas le seul pourvoyeur à agir pour le bien de ce relais. Il y en a plein d'autres. Considérez-les comme des frères.
Tu imagines bien qu'après ce qui vient de se produire à Dalimil, nous avons eu l'occasion de nous remettre en question.
Nous acceptons volontiers tes conditions. Alors je t'en prie, sois notre chef.
This is the only moment the game talks about stopping slavery, and it happens through the power of friendship. Because yes, in other towns there were either no pro-slavery people, or they quickly disappeared from the story. In Martha's town, the lady who gave her baby to the authorities, or her friend who thinks she was right to do so, or the guy who asks us to murder his best friend when he discovers that he was a bearer, they all disappear when the quest starts being about helping bearers settle in a nearby village. They could have been used to create an interesting situation where Clive needs to deal with racist people that don't like us illegally helping bearers. But no, the only time a situation like that happens, it's solved through the power of friendship. When you write a story with slavery and racism as important theme and present them as problems you need to fight, you need slavery and racism to be resolved by the end of the story. That is basic storytelling. You cannot have a satisfying ending if the problem you put in your story are not resolved. But since the game never addresses the political aspect of slavery, or refuses to criticize the racist ideology which justifies those policies, there is no solution to slavery by the end of the game. But we still need one. And the same way, the game makes the pro-slavery inhabitants of Martha's town disappear when they started to become annoying, the dev decided to solve the bearer problem, making them disappear. At the end of the game, Ultima is defeated, and Clive finds himself with an enormous quantity of ether that he used to get rid of the blight and remove magic as well as bearers.
Je ferai en sorte qu'il n'y ait plus de pourvoyeurs, d'émissaires, de cristaux ou de magie. Je réduirai tout en cendres.
Which brings me to this sentence I never thought I'd say one day. It is not because your game is named Final Fantasy that it is okay to go for the final solution. You can't write a game where a minority is enslaved and the solution be the suppression of that minority. That is Hitler's solution to racism. This is the worst possible resolution. Clive denied an entire group their identities in an action that really looks like a genocide. And you may think genocide is too strong of a word for that situation. But according to the UN definitions, the act of genocide applies to acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial or religious group. And I think that's kind of what Clive does at the end of the game. He intentionally uses a spell to wipe out a racial group, the Bearers. And yes, Clive does not kill the Bearer, the magic gene is removed from them in a peaceful process. But a genocide can be committed in time of peace, and it can occur without directly killing a population. And yes, using magic is not listed among the recognized means of conducting genocide, but I think that's because there is no magic in our world, not because it would be okay to use magic to remove a race, like what the fuck? And if you still think I'm wrong and this is no genocide, I would like to ask you, does that really matter? Whether or not it's within the definition of genocide does not change the fact that bearers disappear. Because of Clive. Even if he does that with good intention, trying to put an end to racism, it is still very problematic. You don't end racism by erasing a race. That's fucked up. And I already hear the explanations. Clive doesn't really have a choice. He has to suppress magic to stop the blight, and without magic, bearers can no longer be. He doesn't do that because he wants them to disappear, but because it's the only way to save the world. But first of all, you have to realize this is worse to come and say the bearers must disappear for the world to survive. But also, the two explanations for the blight are that it's either because of the crystals or because of war. It would not have been hard to explain that small quantities of magic are not a problem and don't cause the blight, so bearers are not a danger for the world, especially considering they cannot do a lot of magic without turning to stone. That conclusion is one of the worst conclusions the story can have. The goal of the story is to stop Ultima, to prevent him from using his power, because even if he wants to save the world, he also wants to remove humanity, and that's not okay. There is a parallel I find interesting between Ultima, who wants to remove humanity because of a war that happened thousands of years ago, and the racism bearer experienced because of a war that happened hundreds of years ago. As I said already, those are elements that are introduced at the very end of the game. It's mostly interesting to think about what the game could have been if those ideas had been used as a base for the narration instead of being vague lore elements. But it's also interesting because it shows how the people making the game don't understand their own story. With that parallel and Ultima being the villain because of the way he treats humanity, and yeah, that's why he's the bad guy. If he just wanted to save the world, resurrect his friend and live peacefully with humans, he would not be a villain. I wonder why he doesn't lie to Clive so he helps him instead of revealing his plan like a bad guy cliché from a bad story, but yeah, anyway. With that parallel between the way Ultima treats humanity and the way humanity treats bearers, the game says that humanity allowing slavery is no better than Ultima. The problem comes when Clive ends up treating the bearer in the same way Ultima wanted to treat humanity. That is, for me, a bad ending. Not just because it's bad, but because, fundamentally, the game ends with something it presents as being bad. And I don't think that's on purpose, because it's presented as a good ending, with a post-generic cutscene showing how much of a paradise the world has become thanks to Clive. In the end, he was right to do so. For me, considering what the game says, the obvious solution would have been the end of slavery, not the end of bearers. In one of the last side quests, we learn the name Bearer comes from Bearer of the Heavenly Blessing, a name from a time where people with the ability to do magic were seen as chosen one and a source of happiness for the population. A world without hatred toward bearers can exist. It has already existed, but instead of a conclusion where discrimination is over and the world accepts them once again, the devs decided the world is not for them. As a conclusion, I want to make it clear that even if I think Final Fantasy XVI failed, it's not only because of how the game ends. There are a lot of other problems. The gameplay is crappy too. The pacing is all over the place because of the side quests that become main quests. The combat takes too long to set itself up, with the last abilities being right at the end of the game. A combat system that becomes repetitive as soon as you start doing side quests because they are all built in the exact same way. Exploration is boring because there is nothing interesting to find. Crafting is useless because of the lack of weaknesses to exploit, asking you to choose between using Clive-based weapon and upgrading it with items you get as main quest rewards, or exploring to make other weapons that are going to have the same stat but slightly worse. All of that in a game that is not challenging anyway. But also, that conclusion represents all the story's mistakes. And to know how to explain that, I would like to talk about an interview given by Naoki Yoshida and Hiroshi Takai, the same guys than before, for Game Informer. Game Informer that closed as I was making this video. The article is only available through the Wayback Machine. You can find the link in the description, like for every other source I used in the video. In that interview, Naoki Yoshida explained they wanted to make a game that feel real and talk about complex and violent themes such as war. You can't have war without certain imagery. Clive is in the trenches, he's fighting for his life, he's covered with dirt and blood. Once you start limiting that when you're trying to create something that's very real, it takes the player out of the reality and makes it feel more like a game. That is what they didn't want to do. And I think that's a complete failure. I mean, if there is one thing Final Fantasy XVI is not, it is realist. The game keeps reminding you that it's a game. The quest structure is already not the best for immersion, but the quest markers that take all the screen without any way to remove them, that's a constant reminder that you are playing a video game. The cutscenes that pause themselves and open the map for you to click on it, that's the same. The relationships between the characters don't feel real when the first thing the main character says when the woman he loves gets kidnapped is, "It's okay," just so they can introduce side quests before we go save her. Relationships are not realistic when Clive doesn't have any question to ask his brother he hasn't seen in 18 years. There is nothing realistic in that. The environmental crisis is not realistic when the problem is that no plant can grow in the Blight, but you've put plants everywhere in the Blight. Or when we are introduced to extinct species that show up the second Clive starts looking for them. Just after that, in the interview, he explained they were not going out of their way to create content that was violent or sensationalist. And I find it crazy to explain you didn't go out of your way to put violence in your game just one sentence after explaining you needed the game to have a mature rating in order to put all the violence you wanted and show it the way you wanted in cutscene. And I think that allows us to respond to the question I was asking earlier. Is Clive being dumb the reason the game is unable to say anything interesting with all his theme? Or is it because the game doesn't want to say anything interesting that Clive is dumb? And since they keep referring to Clive as Logos, I don't think they wanted him to be dumb. It's because the game refuses to engage with his theme that Clive ends up being dumb. And it's the same with the game conclusion. Final Fantasy XVI is not a great game that fucked up his ending. It's a fucked up game. The conclusion is just the moment where you have to accept the game is fucked up, that they have nothing to say about all the themes they've put in it. Clive keeps saying he wants bearers to be free so they can live as they want. But the bearers will never be free to choose if they want to do magic like the bearer of the past, or live simply without magic, like Lubor. They will never have the choice to live as they want, because Clive denies them of that choice. Clive, who was the first to say he wanted their freedom, Clive who is presented as Logos. The only reason that conclusion exists is because the people who made the game never thought about what they were doing with it. Those themes are not in the game because they have interesting things to say about them. They are in the game for the aesthetic, the imagery. Like in any other Final Fantasy, we fought against monsters or other people. The biggest improvement of Final Fantasy XVI is that after those battles, Clive is covered in blood. They wanted to talk about complex and violent themes such as war. The end result is that after killing people, you have blood on your hair. And yes, technically speaking, that's pretty impressive. I give them that. But that's not talking about complex theme. They wanted to create a mature game, but the only mature thing in the game is the rating.